Dr. Aldrich's thermometer froze at 38 degrees below zero. Then it did something no one in Ashford, Minnesota had ever seen. The mercury column, which had faithfully measured temperatures for 15 years, became a solid mass. It was immobile, useless. It could not register the cold that continued to deepen. Then, as the temperature plunged even further, the glass tube cracked. It sounded like a pistol shot. The frozen mercury shattered into fragments. They scattered across the doctor's porch like tiny silver tears. It was January 7th, 1889. The cold had exceeded what human instruments could measure. Old-timers later guessed the temperature reached 60 to 70 degrees below zero before dawn. This was a profound cold. It went beyond any ordinary winter. The settlers of Minnesota were not ready for it. Their wooden houses, cast-iron stoves, and modest woodpiles could not withstand it. Trees in the forests exploded. Their frozen sap expanded, breaking bark and wood. Cattle died standing, flash frozen before they could even fall. The air itself seemed to crystallize. Each breath turned into a cloud of ice that fell tingling to the ground. It did not just disappear. Every well in Ashford froze solid by midnight. Every woodpile shrank faster than anyone thought possible. Each family discovered, in the most brutal way imaginable, that their preparations were catastrophically inadequate. The cold was a patient and merciless enemy. It tested everything they thought they knew about survival, and it was winning. 3 miles north of town, on a homestead everyone had mocked for 3 years, Maren Thorvald opened the door of her cabin. The world outside had become hostile to human life. Her triple-walled cabin, however, stood as a quiet defiance. Inside, the air felt warm. 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Cool by summer standards, but so warm compared to the death outside that it felt almost tropical. Her massive stone stove radiated heat. She had fired it at dusk. 12 hours later, its thermal mass still held enough warmth to keep the cabin comfortable. Her root cellar, dug 20 feet deep, held food enough for 2 winters. The woodshed, built like a fortress, was full. It contained more fuel than she could burn in 5 years. Maren had seen this cold coming. She had told the town it was on its way, showed them the signs, begged them to get ready. 3 years ago, she stood in the Ashford Town Hall. She described exactly what would happen. The deep cold. How long it would last. What it would mean for those who were not prepared. They had laughed at her. They called her the Doom Widow, the crazy Norwegian, the woman who saw disasters in every cloud. They dismissed her warnings. They said grief had unhinged her mind. The town made their usual preparations for usual winters. Maren, meanwhile, built something extraordinary. Now, their thermometers lay shattered. Their fires were failing. Their children were beginning to freeze. Runa, her dapple-gray mare, nickered from the stable attached to the cabin. The stable shared the heat of the main structure. The same engineering that kept Maren alive also kept her horse warm. They laughed for 3 years, Maren said quietly. She spoke in the Norwegian her grandmother had taught her. But children should not die for their parents' pride. She began to harness Runa to the sledge. She had built it for exactly this purpose. Maren had arrived in Minnesota during the spring of 1878. She had followed her husband, Christopher, from the small fishing villages of Norway, chasing the promise of America. They had been married for 4 years by then. They had already buried 2 infants in the rocky soil of their homeland. The New World offered a better chance than the fishing life that was slowly starving their village. Christopher was a boat builder. He understood wood and the weather and the sea that could kill careless men without warning. But Minnesota had no sea. The skills that kept him alive on the North Atlantic proved useless against the dangers of the prairie. He died in the blizzard of 1881. Caught between the barn and the house during a whiteout, his body was found 20 feet from the door when the snow finally melted in the spring. Maren had been alone ever since. Alone, but not helpless. She carried a different kind of knowledge, one Christopher never possessed. It was knowledge passed down through generations of Norwegian women who had survived winters that would have killed any man who relied on strength alone. Her grandmother, Astrid, was a weather reader back in the old country. Such women were valued. They could predict storms days in advance. They could read the behavior of animals, the patterns of clouds, and the subtle signs that nature provided to those patient enough to observe. Astrid had taught Marin's mother, and Marin's mother had taught her. Now, Marin carried wisdom that stretched back centuries. It was a legacy of survival in one of the harshest climates on Earth. The summer of 1886 brought the first warnings. It started with the bees. Marin kept beehives, not just for honey, but because they spoke of coming weather. In June, she saw something she had never seen before. The bees were sealing their hives with propolis far thicker than normal, closing every crack and gap with a desperation that spoke of instinct older than human memory. Her grandmother Astrid had taught her what this meant. The bees sensed a winter so harsh, humans could not yet imagine it. Then other signs began to appear. Squirrels gathered nuts with a frantic energy, far beyond their usual autumn work. They buried food in amounts that suggested a long, lean winter. The woolly caterpillars Marin found were entirely black. Not the usual brown and black bands, but solid black from end to end. This was a warning Marin had heard of, but never witnessed herself. Geese flew south in August, 2 months earlier than usual. The elk moved down from the high country just as early. Each sign built on the last, painting a clear picture for Marin. An extreme cold event was coming. This would not be an ordinary Minnesota winter, brutal as those could be. This was something deeper, a freeze that would exceed anything anyone alive had experienced. It would kill those who were unprepared. It would test even those who thought themselves ready. In the autumn of 1886, Marin knew what she had to do. She asked for time at the monthly town meeting. She stood before the assembled settlers of Ashford. She laid out everything she had seen. The bees, the squirrels, the caterpillars, the geese. All the signs her grandmother had taught her to read. They all pointed to a winter unlike any they had ever known. Her English still carried an accent, but her words were clear. Not this winter, she told them. Perhaps not next winter, but within 3 years, a cold will come that will kill anyone who is not prepared. The animals know. They are preparing. We should do the same. The response was swift and brutal. Jasper Whitfield was the mayor of Ashford, a former railroad man. He had made his money selling land. He saw himself as the voice of reason, a thin, precise man. He believed in progress, in science, in American methods over old European ideas. His voice dripped with scorn. Mrs. Thorvald is asking us to believe that bees can predict the weather, he said. That squirrels know more about climate than the meteorological offices in Washington. He paced before the crowd, that we should abandon our plans and our progress based on the folklore of Norwegian peasants. Laughter filled the town hall, the easy cruelty of people who needed someone to feel superior to. Whitfield played to his audience. With respect to Mrs. Thorvald's grandmother, he continued, "We live in an age of science now. We have thermometers and barometers and telegraph reports from weather stations across the territory. If an extraordinary cold event were coming, the authorities would warn us. We do not need to consult bees." More laughter. More mockery. Marin stood at the front of the room. Her face burned with shame. She knew then that words would not convince these people. Only time would prove her right. And by then, it might be too late for many of them. This clash of old wisdom and new pride was about to meet its test. Marin returned to her homestead. She began preparing right away. Her original cabin was fine for normal winters, but Marin knew what was coming. It would not be enough. The first year, she rebuilt the cabin. She put up new walls. These walls had 3 layers of logs, sawdust packed between them. This created insulation that would resist even the most extreme cold. She installed a stone stove. This was the type her people had used for centuries. It had massive thermal mass that would store heat for 12 hours after each firing. Marin added an attached stable. Runa, her mare, would live there. Runa's body heat would help warm the living space. The second year, Marin focused on food. She expanded her garden. She preserved everything she grew. She traded for supplies that would keep for years. Her root cellar was 6 meters deep. The temperature there never dropped below 4 degrees Celsius. It filled with barrels of salted meat, crocks of pickled vegetables, bins of grain and dried beans. Everything needed to survive a long siege of cold. The third year, Marin stockpiled fuel, mostly wood, cords and cords of split oak and maple. She stacked it under a roof to protect it from moisture. It was enough to burn hot fires twice daily for 5 years without running short. She also gathered coal when she could, dried peat from the bogs north of town, anything else that would burn when the time came. The people of Ashford watched her work. Their mockery grew. The doomed widow is building an ark, Jasper Whitfield joked at the general store. Settlers gathered there to buy supplies and gossip. Perhaps she expects the snow to reach 20 meters this winter. Should we start gathering animals 2 by 2? Laughter rippled through the store. The nickname stuck. The doomed widow, the crazy Norwegian. She saw catastrophe everywhere. She spent her summers preparing for winters that never came as bad as she predicted. She lived in fear. Sensible people lived in progress. Caroline Whitfield, the mayor's wife, offered her own thoughts. The poor creature lost her husband in the blizzard of '81. She has never recovered. This obsession with weather and preparation, it is her way of trying to control what cannot be controlled. We should pity her, not mock her. But Maren was not broken by Christopher's death. She had mourned him. She had moved on. Norwegian women had always moved on. They found strength in work and purpose in preparation. The settlers of Ashford could not see her strength. They saw only damage where there was actually wisdom. The winter of 1888 and 1889 started gently. December stayed almost warm. Temperatures barely dipped below freezing. The people of Ashford told each other the doom widow had been wrong again. Her predictions had failed. The bees were confused. The squirrels had been mistaken. 3 years of Maren's hard work, they said, had been 3 years wasted. Then January arrived. The cold came suddenly, just as Maren had known it would. On January 5th, the air was -9 degrees Celsius. Chilly, but manageable. On January 6th, it plunged to -23 degrees Celsius. And then, on January 7th, the bottom fell out of the thermometers entirely. A killing cold descended on Minnesota, a fury that would become legend. Dr. Aldrich's thermometer was not the only one to fail. Across Ashford, the mercury instruments that settlers trusted to measure their world froze solid. They cracked, they shattered. They simply could not register a cold that existed beyond their design limits. Alcohol thermometers fared a little better, but even they could not give true readings when the temperature dropped past -45 degrees Celsius, then -50. The cold went into regions no instrument in the settlement could measure. The wooden houses started failing right away. Heat bled through walls that had seemed adequate. It escaped through every window and door, every tiny crack in every structure. The cast iron stoves that had served for years now glowed cherry red. Still, they could not warm the rooms they occupied. Families burned their furniture. They burned their books. They ripped up floorboards. Anything that would catch flame. And still, the cold crept closer, patient and merciless. By midnight on January 7th, the first casualties appeared. Old Henrik Larsson, who lived alone at the edge of town, was found frozen in his bed. His stove was cold. His woodpile was empty. The Garrett infant, just 6 months old, died despite being wedged between both parents, under every blanket they owned. 2 of the Miller farmhands tried to reach the barn to save their livestock. They froze within 6 meters of the door. The death toll would reach 11 before anyone thought to seek help from the woman they had mocked for 3 years. It was young Thomas Whitfield, the mayor's 16-year-old son, who finally spoke the forbidden words. "Father," he said, his teeth chattering uncontrollably, even with 3 coats wrapped around him and a fire eating the last of their furniture. "Mrs. Thorvald's cabin. She built it for this. She's been preparing for 3 years. If anyone's still warm..." Jasper Whitfield's face cycled through denial, then anger, then shame. Finally, it settled on the desperation of a man whose family was dying and whose pride could no longer matter. "Go," he said. "Find out if she's alive. If she is, ask if she can help." Thomas began the journey. 5 kilometers through a cold so lethal it should have killed him. Exposed flesh froze in seconds. He navigated by memory and by a desperation that burned hotter than any fire. His breath crystallized into ice, falling from his face like a frozen beard. He collapsed at Maren's door, more dead than alive. His voice was a croaking whisper, barely audible. "My family. The town is freezing. Thermometers broke. Please." Maren pulled him inside without a word. She wrapped him in thick furs and sat him before the massive stone stove, which still radiated the heat of 12 hours past. She gave him warm broth from a pot that always simmered on her cooking surface. She watched the color slowly return to his frost-white face. "Your father sent you," she said. It was not a question. Thomas nodded, his jaw still chattering too much to speak. "The man who called me the doomed widow, the one who said we do not need to consult bees." Thomas nodded again, shame clear in his eyes despite the cold that still gripped him. Marin was silent for a long moment. She looked at the young man whose father had led the mockery for 3 years. She could refuse. She could let them face the consequences of their arrogance. She could sit in her warm cabin and listen to the wind, knowing she had been right all along. But there were children in Ashford, children who had never called her anything. They were shivering in houses that could not protect them. They might die because their parents had been too proud to listen. "How many are left?" she asked. "I do not know. Maybe 40, maybe fewer. Some have already." He could not finish. "Can they travel?" "Some. The strongest, if they knew there was shelter." Marin stood. She began pulling on her coat, the heavy furs her grandmother had taught her to sew. Clothes designed for a cold that would kill anyone dressed for an ordinary winter. "Go back. Tell anyone who can move to head north toward my homestead. Follow the tree line. It will break the wind. Those who cannot move, stay with them. Keep them warm as long as possible. I will come with the sledge for the weak ones." She harnessed Runa, loaded the sledge with furs and hot stones wrapped in blankets, and set out into the killing cold to save the people who had laughed at her for 3 years. The evacuation took 2 days. Marin made 6 trips through conditions that should have been lethal, pulling the elderly, the children, and the sick on her sledge. The able-bodied walked behind, guided by ropes Marin had strung between trees. This kept them from wandering off course in the disorienting, blinding cold. Runa, Marin's dapple gray mare, pulled until she trembled with exhaustion. Then she rested in the attached stable, where the shared heat of the cabin kept her alive. And then she pulled again. 43 people survived in Marin's cabin during the worst of the cold. 43 souls packed into a space designed for one. They shared body heat. They shared Marin's food stores. They shared the warmth that radiated from thick stone walls and a stove that needed only 2 firings each day to maintain a livable temperature. They slept in shifts. They ate from the stores Marin had accumulated over 3 years. They drank water from the deep well, unfrozen because it reached below the frost line. The cold lasted 9 days. 9 days during which Marin's preparations were the only thing standing between 43 people and death. 9 days during which the Doom Widow's predictions proved more accurate than any meteorological office, more reliable than any thermometer, more valuable than any scientific instrument that men of progress had trusted. The cold finally let up. It still sat at a brutal -29 degrees Celsius, but for the survivors, it felt like warmth. They stepped out of Marin's cabin into a world that had completely changed. Ashford Town had suffered terribly. Houses had split open, timbers cracking from the extreme cold. Hundreds of livestock had died. 11 people had died before Marin even started the evacuation. 3 more had perished on the journey to safety. But 43 had lived. These were the people who had laughed at Marin, who had called her bees and caterpillars foolish. They had dismissed her 3 years of preparation. Now they owed their lives to the woman they had called a grief-stricken fool. The community gathered in March. They met in Marin's cabin, the only building large enough and warm enough to hold everyone. They came to face what had happened, to mourn the dead, to acknowledge the living, and to honor the woman who had saved them all. Jasper Whitfield spoke first. He was the mayor who had led the mockery, who had compared Marin to Noah building an ark. He had called her warnings peasant superstition, unworthy of a scientific age. Now he stood before the community he had almost destroyed. His voice was barely a whisper. 3 years ago, he began. Marin Thorvald stood in our town hall. She told us what was coming. She described the signs she had seen. She begged us to prepare. I laughed at her. I called her predictions folklore. I said we do not need to consult bees. He stopped. Tears streamed down his face. My thermometer shattered because it could not measure the cold she predicted. My house almost killed my family. I built for ordinary winters. She built for the worst that could come. 14 people died in Ashford because I was too proud to listen to a woman who knew more than I did about survival. He looked at Marin. She sat apart from the group as she always had. I do not know how to apologize for what I did, he said. I do not know how to make amends for the people who died because I convinced this town not to listen. I only know that I was wrong about everything. The bees, the predictions, Mrs. Thorvald herself. And I will spend whatever years I have left trying to be worthy of the mercy she showed us. Caroline Whitfield spoke next. She was the woman who had offered pity instead of respect, who had called Marin a poor creature broken by grief. Now she wept. I said she was damaged, Caroline confessed. I said her preparations were her way of trying to control what could not be controlled. I was the one who was damaged. Damaged by pride, by certainty, by the belief that my way of understanding the world was the only valid way. She looked at Marin. You are not broken. You are the strongest person I have ever known. Others spoke after that. Families whose children had survived shared their stories. The elderly whom Marin had carried to safety on her sledge. The young men who had followed the ropes through cold that would have killed them without guidance. When the testimonies ended, Marin stood up. She walked to the center of the gathering. Her face was weathered from 3 years of hard work outside. Her hands were calloused from the labor that had saved 43 lives. She was not a woman who sought attention, but she knew some things needed to be said. My grandmother taught me to read the signs, she said. She taught me that animals know things we do not know, that nature provides warnings for those patient enough to observe. She taught me that the old ways exist because they work. Generations of people survived by following them. Wisdom does not become foolish simply because it is old. She looked at Jasper Whitfield. You trusted your thermometers and your meteorological offices. They failed you. The bees did not fail. The squirrels did not fail. The knowledge of Norwegian women who have survived 1,000 winters did not fail. The only failure was in refusing to listen. Marin paused. 14 people died. That number will stay with me forever. But 43 lived, and I choose to focus on the living rather than the dead. The dead cannot be helped. The living can learn. She gestured around the cabin that had saved them. Everything I built, I can teach you to build. The walls, the stove, the root cellar, the woodshed. None of it is secret. None of it is beyond your abilities. What I cannot teach is humility that you must find for yourselves. That summer, Ashford changed. The survivors rebuilt their homes. They constructed triple-walled cabins. They installed stone stoves. They dug deep root cellars and stockpiled fuel in amounts that once would have seemed impossible. Marin oversaw every step. She taught every building technique. She shared all the knowledge her grandmother had passed down. Jasper Whitfield resigned as mayor. He called himself unfit to lead the community he had nearly destroyed. His son, Thomas, took over years later. Thomas became a leader who never ignored warnings, no matter their source. He consulted farmers, old women, anyone who might see things he could not see. The phrase "reading the bees" entered the vocabulary of the Minnesota frontier. It then spread across the northern territories. This meant paying attention to natural signs. It meant trusting traditional knowledge. It meant getting ready for disasters that scientific instruments might not predict. People spoke the phrase with quiet respect. It was as if they understood something about survival that only came from almost freezing to death. Marin Thorvald lived on her homestead for another 38 years. She died in the winter of 1927 at 79 years old. She never remarried. Christopher had been her only love, but she was never alone. The community that once mocked her became a community that honored her. The children she saved grew up knowing the quiet widow to the north had kept them alive when nothing else could. Her beehives were maintained by the community for decades after her death. Each new generation watched the bees for signs that might warn of coming danger. The hives still exist today. The Ashford Historical Society tends them now. Their behavior is observed each autumn by people who remember what their great-grandparents almost forgot. Above the door of Marin's cabin, carved in both Norwegian and English, is an inscription. It reads, Bien avet, or The Bees Know. Her grandmother, Astrid, who taught her to read the signs in a village half a world away, would have recognized the truth in those words. She would have smiled to see how far that wisdom had traveled. The mercury column in Dr. Aldrich's thermometer froze at negative 39 degrees Celsius. It had reached its limit, but Marin's knowledge had measured a cold far deeper than any instrument could. The bees did not fail. The squirrels did not fail. The wisdom of Norwegian women who survived 1,000 winters did not fail. The only failure was in refusing to listen. If you find value in understanding how forgotten knowledge can still guide us, subscribe. The 12th of January, 1888, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Outside, the world was gone. There was no sky, no ground, just a white, horizontal vortex that shrieked across the prairie. The wind hit the Wyoming plains like a physical monster. It carried ice pellets that scoured wood down to its grain. Inside the dugout, Silas Garrett called home. The only sound was the soft hiss of the cast-iron stove. A page rustled gently. The air was a comfortable 13 degrees Celsius. A single oil lamp cast a warm, golden glow on the packed earth walls and the thick timber beams overhead. Silas, a 2-year-old man with hands like cured leather and eyes the color of a winter sky, sat in his handmade chair. He was reading a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius. A few feet away, a sturdy tunnel led to a smaller, equally snug dugout. His gray mare, Misty, crunched contentedly on a ration of oats. She was safe from a storm that was already killing horses by the dozen in their proud, drafty barns. This blizzard, which would later be known as the Schoolhouse Blizzard, had descended without warning for most, but for Silas Garrett, it was not a surprise. He had seen it coming. It was an inevitability he had been getting ready for since the first day he had driven a spade into the earth. 9 months ago. 9 months before that storm, in the budding green of April 1887, Silas Garrett arrived in Summit, Wyoming. He was not like other homesteaders. He did not talk about huge harvests or cattle. Silas spoke of windbreaks. He spoke of thermal mass. He was a veteran of the Army Corps of Engineers. He had spent 2 hard winters surveying the Dakota Territory. There, he saw Mother Nature's cruel side up close. He watched men freeze solid just 100 yards from their own homes. Entire herds of cattle perished, frozen upright in the snow. Silas brought his plan to Mayor Hutchkins at the land office. The mayor had big dreams for Summit, but he liked things done the usual way. A dugout? Hutchkins scoffed. He stroked his thick mustache. Mr. Garrett, we are building a modern town here, a town of the future, clapboard houses, 2-story fronts, not gopher holes. Silas stayed calm. He unrolled a rough drawing on the mayor's desk. Sir, he said, a structure built into the south-facing side of a hill, with 1 meter of sod and earth overhead, will keep a steady temperature all year. It will be cool in the summer. More important, it will stand strong against the winter. He explained that the earth itself was insulation. The wind can blow 160 kilometers an hour over the top, and inside, you will barely hear it. I can build the whole thing, a main room and a connected stable for my horse for under $200. Hutchkins squinted at the drawing. It looked crude, almost wild. And a proper house, he asked. What does that cost? A proper house, as you call it, Silas answered, will cost you 10 times that in lumber alone. And 10 times that again in firewood just to keep your bones from freezing come January. I am not building for show, Mr. Mayor. I am building to survive. The mayor looked at the small amount Silas planned to spend. He shrugged. It was Silas's land. His money. If the man wanted to live in a hole, it was no concern of Summit. He stamped the claim for a rocky, unwanted plot on a hill 3 kilometers outside town. The land cost $50. The estimated cost of the home was $175. Word of Silas's project spread through Summit like wildfire. The general store, the town's social hub, buzzed with gossip. Montgomery Sterling, the county's wealthiest rancher, held court by the Cracker Barrel. Sterling measured progress in board feet and panes of glass. He was building a grand Victorian house, 2 stories tall, with a wide porch and bay windows. It would cost him nearly $3,000. Heard about the new fellow Garrett? Sterling boomed, his voice dripping with scorn. The Army engineer plans to live in a hole like a prairie dog. Laughter echoed through the store. Thomas Brennan, Sterling's builder, chimed in. A hole is right. A man could dig his own grave for a lot less than $200. What happens when the spring rains come? He will drown in his own bed. The name stuck. From that day on, Silas's home was Garrett's grave. People spoke his name with a mix of pity and contempt. Silas came to town only for supplies. He heard the whispers. He saw the smirks. He ignored them. He had work to do. Construction began in May. It was a solitary, massive effort. Silas and his gray mare, Misty, worked as a team. He plowed and cut the thick prairie sod into heavy, brick-like rectangles. Misty, harnessed to a stoneboat, a simple wooden sled dragged the sod bricks and the heavy timbers he had hauled from the nearest wood lot up the hillside. First, he excavated the hillside. He dug back 7.6 meters and carved out a space 9.1 meters wide. He was not just digging a hole, he was engineering a dwelling. The floor was packed clay, hammered until it was hard as stone. Thick cottonwood logs reinforced the walls. The roof was a masterpiece of frontier engineering. Heavy timber beams formed the main structure. He layered them with willow branches. Then came a thick coating of prairie hay for insulation. Finally, he laid the heavy sod bricks grass side down. This created a living, interlocking roof. Its own root system would hold it together. He built a stone hearth and chimney at the back of the structure. Its mass would absorb and radiate heat. He fashioned a single, large window on the south-facing front wall. It was angled to catch the low winter sun. Then he dug a smaller connecting tunnel. He excavated the stable. It was a smaller, cozier version of the main house. The entire project took him 3 months of back-breaking labor. He worked from sunup to sundown. The final cost, including the stove, a single glass window pane, and nails, came to about 145 pounds. The summer sun beat down, but the town's mockery grew hotter. Montgomery Sterling's grand house rose plank by proud plank. It was a monument to his wealth. Each Sunday, people rode out just to watch Silas work. They shook their heads, amused. A betting pool started in the saloon. How long would Garrett's grave actually last? Most people put their money on the first heavy snow collapsing the roof. Soon, a new phrase entered their language. When someone took on a foolishly hard task, ignoring all common sense, people would say they were pulling a Garrett. It meant wasting time on a lost cause. It meant digging your own grave through sheer stubbornness. Even Miss Harriet Thornton, the kind new schoolteacher, got a quiet warning. The mayor's wife, Mrs. Hutchkins, told her to keep her distance from the town eccentric. "He is a strange one," she had said. "Best not to get involved." Silas heard it all. He felt the isolation, a wall built of whispers and laughter, but he had his work, he had his horse, and he had a deep certainty. He had lived through blizzards before. He knew what was coming. It was not a matter of if, but when. By late September, the dugout was finished. The first hints of its real strength were subtle. A heat wave baked the valley in the last days of summer. Sterling's new house felt like an oven. But inside Silas's home, insulated by the cool earth, the temperature stayed a pleasant 18 degrees Celsius. Then the first autumn frost arrived in October. The situation flipped. While others frantically fed their stoves against the encroaching chill, the heavy earth around Silas's home held the day's warmth. A small fire in the evening was enough to keep the space comfortable until morning. The town, though, still did not care. "A cool cellar in the summer proves nothing," Sterling declared. "Wait until real winter comes. We will see who is comfortable then. Me in my parlor with its German stove, or him in his dirt coffin." Silas just went about his business. He stocked his larder. He cut and stacked firewood. He enjoyed the quiet solitude of his unconventional home. He felt no anger, only a quiet, grim patience. The first week of January, 1888, felt strangely mild. A warm wind, a chinook, blew down from the mountains. It melted the little snow on the ground. The frozen earth turned to mud. Everyone in Summit celebrated this thaw. It felt like an early spring. But Silas Garrett felt no comfort at all. He saw the warning signs. The land offered them to anyone who knew how to look. A strange green tint appeared in the western sky at sunset. Prairie birds, usually rare in winter, gathered in large numbers near the creek bed. Then he watched the cattle. They bunched together in the fields, restless and agitated. On the morning of January 11th, Silas made his final preparations. He hauled extra water buckets from his well. He filled a large barrel inside the dugout. He chopped enough kindling to last a week and stacked it by the stove. He moved 4 extra bales of hay into Misty's stable through the connecting tunnel. This meant he would not have to go outside for anything. He checked the seal on his door. He checked the single pane of his window. He made a trip to the general store for coffee and salt. There, he tried to warn old Samuel, the proprietor. "There is a bad one coming, Samuel," he said quietly. This warmth is a liar. I have seen it before." Old Samuel just chuckled. "Silas, you have been saying that since you got here. Enjoy the sunshine. It might be the last we see for a while, but it is not the end of the world." Silas bought his goods and left. He had done what he could. January 12th dawned bright. It felt deceptively pleasant. Children walked to the one-room schoolhouse in light coats. Ranchers rode out to check their herds without heavy gear. Around 11 in the morning, the change began. A dark, boiling wall of cloud appeared on the northwestern horizon. Old-timers called it a blue norther. The wind died. An eerie, absolute silence fell over the prairie. Then the front hit. It was not a storm. It was an atmospheric explosion. The temperature had been a mild 1 degree Celsius. It plummeted. Within an hour, it was below zero. By mid-afternoon, it was negative 29 degrees Celsius. The wind gusted over 97 kilometers per hour. This created a wind chill that was simply unsurvivable. The snow did not fall. It flew horizontally. It was a blinding, scouring blizzard. Visibility dropped to zero. The Schoolhouse Blizzard had struck. It caught the entire territory by surprise. In Summit, chaos erupted. Montgomery Sterling's grand Victorian home, the pride of the county, became a shattered wreck. North-facing bay windows blasted inward, ripped from their frames by the wind. Snow and ice flooded the parlor, instantly putting out the expensive German stove. Shingles tore from the roof. The whole house groaned, as if some giant hand was pulling it apart. Sterling and his family huddled in the kitchen, stuffing blankets into the broken windows. Their initial pride had turned to raw terror. All over town, the story was the same. The normal houses, built above ground, were just wooden traps. Snow blocked chimneys, filling rooms with choking smoke. Doors froze solid, roofs started to sag under the impossible weight of the drifts piling up. People froze in their own homes. Their firewood, which had seemed like plenty, was suddenly terrifyingly little against the extreme cold. The worst tragedy unfolded at the schoolhouse. Miss Thornton, the teacher, saw how fierce the storm was. She kept the children inside. But the poorly built structure could not stand up to it. The wind found every crack. The single stove was no match for the Arctic blast. They were trapped, 3.2 kilometers away, inside Garrett's grave. Silas fed his fire. The wind howled over the dugout roof, but inside it was just a distant, muffled sound, like a faraway waterfall. The temperature stayed steady. He cooked a simple meal of bacon and beans. The warm, safe smell filled his space. He could feel the deep, lasting safety of the earth all around him. He wasn't fighting the storm. He was sheltered right inside its indifferent heart. Near dusk on the first day, the wind's fury briefly, almost imperceptibly, eased. That's when Silas heard frantic pounding on his thick wooden door. He unbarred it to find a figure caked in ice. It was barely a man. It was Thomas Brennan, the builder. His face was a mask of frostbite. His clothes were frozen stiff. "Garrett, for God's sake," Brennan stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "My roof, the chimney is blocked. We are freezing." Silas said nothing. He just pulled the man inside, sat him by the stove, and wrapped him in a heavy wool blanket. An hour later, more figures appeared, ghosts materializing out of the white chaos. It was Miss Thornton, the school teacher, with 5 of her older students. They had made a desperate run from the failing schoolhouse. They followed a fence line they knew led toward Silas's hill. The teacher was crying, her face raw from the wind. 2 of the children already showed signs of severe frostbite. Silas took them all in. He tended to their frozen hands and feet, gave them hot coffee, and offered his own bed. He huddled closer to the stove himself. His dugout, once a joke, had become an ark. Over the next 36 hours, more people found their way to Silas's door. They followed the thin, steady line of smoke rising from his chimney. Mayor Hutchkins and his wife arrived. Old Samuel from the general store. 2 entire families whose roofs had simply collapsed. Silas brought them all inside. He didn't say a word of blame. "No, I told you so." Garrett's grave, the place everyone mocked, became a crowded sanctuary. 23 people now filled the single room, 15 adults and 8 children. Silas took charge. His old army training came back. He set up shifts to keep the fire going. He carefully shared out his food and water. The children always ate first. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and fear. But it was warm. It was safe. They listened as the blizzard roared outside. It was a monster they could hear, but they couldn't feel its bite. In the lamplight, they looked at the quiet man, the man they had laughed at. He was not just some strange loner. He was a prophet. On the morning of the third day, the storm finally broke. The wind died down. A bright, harsh sun rose over a world completely changed. It was beautiful in a terrifying way. Snowdrifts piled 6 meters high. They buried barns and houses. The town of Summit was gone. A blanket of white had erased it. When the survivors stepped out of the dugout, blinking in the bright light, the true scale of the disaster became clear. Montgomery Sterling's big Victorian house was a ruin. Its entire north wall had fallen in. The schoolhouse roof had collapsed. Dozens of barns were crushed. All their livestock was lost. The final count for Summit was 17 dead. 5 of those were children who never made it home from school. Across the whole territory, hundreds had died. In the silent, frozen aftermath, only one home stood completely intact. One fully working, dwelling in and around Summit, the one they had called Garrett's Grave. 4 days after the blizzard, the few people left in Summit met inside the ruined church. It was a somber, broken gathering. Montgomery Sterling stood before them. His face was bandaged from frostbite. His spirit was gone. His voice, usually so loud and full of pride, was a raw whisper. "I was blind," he said, looking straight at Silas Garrett. "You were the only one who could see. I called your home a grave. It became our ark." He went on. "We built our homes with pride. The wind took them. You built yours with wisdom. It sheltered us. I spent $3,000 on a monument to my own vanity. It is kindling now. You spent less than $200 on a home that saved 23 lives." He paused. His gaze swept over the huddled, grieving families. "I have been a fool. We have all been fools. We thought we knew better than the land itself. We were wrong." He turned back to Silas. His arrogance had vanished, replaced by a desperate humility. "Will you teach us? Will you teach us how to build like you?" The entire assembly turned to Silas. In that moment, he felt no triumph, only deep sorrow for their loss. He stood and looked at the faces before him. The mayor, the builder, the rancher, the teacher. Silas spoke. His voice was calm and steady. "The past is frozen under the snow. Let us build a better future." Montgomery Sterling kept his word. He used what was left of his fortune to fund the reconstruction of Summit, not to rebuild his own mansion. Under Silas Garrett's direction, a new town rose from the ruins. This time, there were no proud 2-story facades. They built as Silas taught them. They used the land itself, digging into the south-facing slopes of the rolling hills. They learned to cut sod. They learned to lay timber for strength. They learned to respect the awesome power of the Wyoming winter. The slang term "pulling a Garrett" was still used, but its meaning had completely changed. Now, it meant applying uncommon foresight to a problem. It meant preparing for what others refused to see. It meant having the courage to be right when the whole world called you a fool. The Garrett method of construction became the standard not just for Summit, but for the surrounding counties. Silas Garrett never went looking for money or power. He lived his days right there in the dugout he built, a respected elder in the community, a living legend. He never married. But he became like a grandfather to all the children who grew up in those warm, safe homes he taught their parents to build. They would come to visit him, bringing fresh bread, sitting and listening to his quiet stories. He died peacefully in his sleep in 1927. He was 82 years old. The entire town came to his funeral. People from 3 counties showed up. They buried him on the hill, looking out over the town he had saved. His legacy was not carved into a bronze plaque. It was etched into the very landscape of the Wyoming prairie. In 1891, the territorial government in Cheyenne sent a team of engineers to Summit. They came to study his designs. They documented his methods for insulation, for ventilation, for structural integrity. The findings became a simple pamphlet, The Garrett Dugout, a guide to sensible frontier construction. It went out to every new homesteader in the territory for the next 20 years. His knowledge, born from harsh experience and once called foolish, became the official wisdom for a whole generation. His gray mare, Misty, the one who helped him build his ark, lived a long life. She was buried right beside him on that quiet hill. His quiet foresight saved more than just one town on one terrible day. It saved countless unknown families in the decades that followed. January 12th, 1888, 3 p.m. Outside, the world had ceased to exist. But inside, wisdom had triumphed over conventional folly, securing a future for those who listened. Pride builds for sunny days. Wisdom builds for storms. Subscribe if this kind of resilience in the face of impossible odds is something you want more of. Emmeline Porter buried her husband on a Tuesday in October. She dug the grave herself. There was no one else to do it. The ground had already started to freeze, the first hints of winter frost. Her shovel hit the hard soil, a sound like a cold bell ringing. It announced something no one wanted to hear. Emmeline was just 22 years old. This was her first Kansas winter, and she was completely alone. William had been sick for 9 days before he died. The fever came on fast, the way typhoid always did. By the time Emmeline realized it was more than just being tired from the harvest, it was too late. She nursed him as best she could. She cooled his forehead with wet cloths, trying to get him to drink water he couldn't keep down. He died quietly on the 8th night. She had dozed off in the chair beside their bed. She woke to silence. Emmeline knew he was gone before she even touched him. Neighbors came for the funeral. Not many. The Haskells from town, who ran the general store, the Muller family 5 kilometers east, and old Martha from north of the creek. Martha had buried 2 husbands of her own. She knew what to say when words didn't matter. They stood around the grave. Emmeline read from the Bible William had brought from Pennsylvania. Then they left. They went home. They left Emmeline alone with 16 hectares of prairie. And the start of winter, Mrs. Haskell was the last to leave. She stood by her wagon. She looked at the half-built sod house, the small flock of chickens pecked at the frozen ground. She saw the young woman standing by a fresh grave, dirt still on her hands. "You should come into town," Mrs. Haskell said. "Work at the boarding house until spring. A woman alone won't make it through winter out here." Emmeline shook her head. "I have the claim. I have my chickens." William laid in 6 months of food before he got sick. Mrs. Haskell scoffed. "You have a death sentence. The chickens will stop laying when the cold comes. Then they'll die. You'll have nothing but frozen ground and empty cupboards." She shook her head. Mrs. Haskell enjoyed delivering bad news. "I'll tell Mr. Haskell to watch for your claim to come up for sale. Someone sensible should have it." She drove away. Emmeline stood in the October wind and watched her go. Emmeline went inside, and the first thing she did was count her provisions. Not because she didn't know what she had, but because counting was something she could do. Doing something, anything, felt better than just standing still. 3 days later, old Martha came back. Her cart was pulled by a mule that looked as old as she did. Martha found Emmeline trying to fix the chicken coop. Emmeline was nailing boards over the gaps where the wind came through. "That won't work," Martha said. She climbed down from the cart, moving carefully, like someone whose joints had seen too many winters. The cold doesn't care about boards. It goes through everything. Emmeline looked at her. Mrs. Haskell had said the chickens would stop laying when winter came. Martha confirmed it. Chickens stop laying when they get cold. Their bodies save energy just to stay alive. They don't make eggs. By December, most flocks give 1 egg a week, maybe 2. By January, nothing. This was a major problem. Emmeline had 18 hens. They had been laying well, 8 to 10 eggs every day. She sold the extra eggs in town for about 15 cents a dozen. That money was for spring seed. If the eggs stopped, the money stopped. If the money stopped, she couldn't buy what she needed to survive. She couldn't plant her claim in the spring. "Then what do I do?" Emmeline asked. Martha looked at the chicken coop, then at the ground beneath it. She looked at something Emmeline couldn't see. "In Germany," Martha said, "my grandmother kept her chickens in the root cellar, below the ground, where the frost cannot reach. The earth stays about 10 to 13 degrees Celsius all year, not warm, but not freezing. Warm enough for the hens to keep laying." Emmeline didn't have a root cellar. "Then you dig one." That was Martha's answer. Emmeline didn't have a root cellar, so she would make one. This simple advice set Emmeline on a 3-week journey of back-breaking labor. She worked from dawn until her arms gave out. Then she ate, slept, and woke up to do it all again. She chose a spot on the south side of a small rise. This was important. It meant rainwater would drain away from the hole, not into it. She dug 2.4 meters down, then she expanded the bottom into a chamber. It was roughly 3 meters square. The walls were just dirt, packed hard by the weight of the earth above. She reinforced the soft spots with scrap lumber, but most of it was solid prairie clay, stable, dry. For the floor, she laid a thick layer of straw, 15 centimeters deep. This would insulate the birds from the cold ground. It also gave them something to scratch in. The ceiling was the hardest part. She couldn't buy proper lumber. The sod bricks she used for her house were too heavy for a span this wide, so she built a low wooden frame. It sat just 90 centimeters above the chamber floor. Then she covered it with layers of prairie, grass, and dirt. It blended perfectly with the rise. From above, it looked like nothing at all, just a small hill. A wooden door was set into its side. It faced south. This kept it away from the brutal north winds of winter. She built a small vestibule, an airlock of sorts. This meant opening the outer door wouldn't let all the warm air escape at once. The inner door was a heavy canvas flap, easy for her to push through, but enough to hold the heat inside. Then there was the light. Chickens need light to lay eggs, not warmth, not food, not comfort. Light. Their bodies respond to the length of the day. When days get short, they stop producing eggs. 2.4 meters underground, there was no natural light at all. Emmeline solved this with a simple skylight. She cut a hole in the roof. She covered it with a piece of cracked glass. She found it in an abandoned claim 3.2 kilometers west. The glass was cracked but intact. It let in enough daylight to trick the hens. They would think the days were longer. She angled the hole to catch the southern sun. This maximized the light during the short winter days. The coop was built. But would the chickens adapt? And would it actually work? The chickens moved underground on November 1st. It was 2 days before the first real snow. They protested at first. The dark, strange new space confused them. But within a week, they had settled in. They scratched at the straw, roosted on the low perches Emmeline had built. They acted like chickens do when they feel safe and warm. The chamber stayed at 11 degrees Celsius, not warm by human standards. But it was warm enough for chickens to be comfortable, warm enough for their bodies to keep making eggs instead of shutting down for survival. Mrs. Haskell came out to check on Emmeline in late November. She rode in a wagon with her husband at the reins. They found Emmeline splitting wood beside her, soddy. She worked steadily despite the cold. She looked nothing like a woman about to give up. "Mrs. Porter," Mrs. Haskell called from the wagon. She didn't bother to climb down. "I see you're still here." "I am." "And your chickens? Surely they've stopped laying by now. Ours gave their last egg 3 days ago." Emmeline set down her axe. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Would you like to buy some eggs, Mrs. Haskell? I have 24 fresh ones in the house." The older woman's face went through several expressions. None of them were pleasant. "That's impossible. No one has eggs this time of year. I do. 15 cents a dozen, same as always. Or I can take them into town myself if you'd rather not buy from a woman who's about to abandon her claim." Emmeline watched Mrs. Haskell's face. It turned red, then white. It settled into a hard expression that made her look older than her years. "Where are your chickens? What have you done with them?" Emmeline smiled. It was a small expression that didn't reach her eyes. "They're underground, Mrs. Haskell, where it's warm." "Would you like to see?" She led them to the underground coop. She opened the outer door, then the canvas flap. The Haskells peered into the warm chamber. 18 hens scratched contentedly in the straw. The air that came out was noticeably warmer than the air outside. It smelled like chickens and straw and earth. It smelled like life continuing when it should have stopped. Mr. Haskell said nothing. He just stared at the chickens, then at the glass skylight, then at the young widow who had figured out something his wife said was impossible. "I'll take 4 dozen eggs," he said finally. "If you have 'em, I'll have 'em by the end of the week. 30 cents. Mrs. Haskell didn't speak to Emmeline again that day. She sat in the wagon while her husband counted out the coins. She sat in the wagon while he drove away. She didn't look back at the young woman standing beside the door to the underground. The first victory was won, but the winter had only just begun. Emmeline's certainty was about to meet the same winter he dismissed. The winter of 1886 into 1887 was brutal. Even by Kansas standards, it was extreme. January saw temperatures drop to -30 degrees Celsius. That kind of cold could freeze livestock where they stood. It could kill anyone caught outside without shelter. Snow piled up in drifts 3 meters high against the north sides of buildings. The wind blew so hard that people couldn't hear each other shout from 3 meters away. But Emmeline's chickens laid through all of it. The underground chamber stayed at a steady 11 degrees Celsius. It was warmer on the days she climbed down to collect eggs, her own body heat adding to the space. The glass skylight let in enough light to keep the hens producing. The deep straw kept them comfortable, and the earth kept them alive. She collected between 6 and 8 eggs every day all winter. This was slightly less than she had gotten in the fall, but it was far more than anyone else in the entire county. She sold them for 15 cents a dozen in November. Then, the price rose to 20 cents in December when the supply across the county simply disappeared. By January, when eggs became genuinely rare, she was charging 30 cents a dozen. And by February, she was asking 50 cents a dozen and still had customers lined up. The money accumulated in a jar under her floorboards. These coins represented more than just survival, they were profit. Emmeline was making money in the dead of winter. Everyone else was burning through their savings and praying for spring. The Haskells, for instance, lost 11 of their 30 chickens that winter. They froze solid in an above-ground coop. It had been built the way coops were always built, exposed to the wind, as vulnerable to the cold as the birds it was supposed to protect. The surviving hens stopped laying in late November. They didn't start again until April. Mrs. Haskell bought eggs from Emmeline every week. She sent her husband to do it. She couldn't bring herself to face the young widow she had dismissed as a fool. She paid 50 cents a dozen. She never complained about the price. What choice did she have? Her hens weren't laying. Nobody's hens were laying, except for the widow Porter's hens. They were scratching around in a hole in the ground, producing eggs like it was still September. Emmeline survived the winter and thrived. But what were the long-term implications of her success? The worst of winter finally broke in March. Old Marta returned to Emmeline's claim. Roads were passable again. She found Emmeline in excellent health. Her provisions were barely touched. The money jar under the floorboards was full. More than full, actually. Marta walked to the underground coop. She found it working perfectly. The hens were fat. They were content. The nesting boxes were full of fresh eggs. Marta looked at Emmeline. "You did it," she said. Her voice held something close to pride. "You survived." Emmeline smiled, a wide, genuine smile. "I did more than survive," she told Marta. "I made money. She had saved enough to buy a plow, enough to buy a team of mules to pull it. She could really work the 16 hectares now. Not just scratch at the edges, like William and she had done. The chickens would stay underground year-round. It was cooler in summer, warmer in winter. They laid better than any flock Emmeline had ever seen. She was already thinking about expanding, building another chamber, getting more birds. Marta nodded slowly. Her weathered face creased. It might have been a smile. "My grandmother would have liked you," she said. "She always said the best farmers are the ones who think like the earth, not against it." Spring came slowly that year. The snow melted in fits and starts. The ground took weeks to thaw. But when planting season finally arrived, Emmeline was ready. She had seeds. She had her plow. She had a team of mules bought from a farmer heading east, giving up. She had everything she needed to make the 16 hectares produce, and she still had the chickens, still laying underground, still producing the eggs that had saved her life. Meanwhile, the Haskells sold their store in 1889. They moved to Denver. Mrs. Haskell never truly recovered from that winter, the one that proved her wrong. The season when the young widow she had dismissed as a fool had thrived, while her own chickens froze. Mrs. Haskell told people her health was failing. Everyone knew the real reason. She could not stand living in a county where a 22-year-old widow had out-farmed her. Emmeline bought the general store. She paid cash. She ran it for 12 years. She sold supplies to the homesteaders who kept coming. They needed eggs. They needed advice. They needed someone who understood what it took to survive on the prairie. She kept chickens behind the store. In another underground coop, she built it the same way she had built the first one. She sold eggs year-round, undercutting everyone else. While still turning a profit, she married again in 1891, a quiet man named Daniel Boone Carter. He had come west to escape a name that was too famous. He found a woman who didn't care what his name was. As long as he worked hard, as long as he treated her well, they had 4 children together. They raised them in a house with an underground root cellar. It stayed 11 degrees Celsius all year long. The original coop, the one Emmeline built with her own hands, stood for years. It stayed until 1923, when her grandson finally filled it in. It had become a hazard for the children playing in the yard, but by then, the idea had spread. Half the farms in the region had underground chicken coops of one kind or another. All of them were built by farmers who had heard the story of the widow who kept her hens laying all winter. There is a photograph of Emmeline from 1920. She stands in front of the general store she owned for 3 decades. She is 56 years old in the picture. Her honey brown hair has gone gray. Her face is lined by the sun and wind. It shows the particular kind of survival that leaves its marks. She is smiling. It's a full smile that reaches her eyes, the smile of someone who knows exactly what she accomplished. She doesn't need anyone else to tell her. The caption under the photo reads, Emmeline Carter, proprietor of Carter's General Store, Cimarron, Kansas. It doesn't mention the chickens. It doesn't mention the underground coop. Nothing about the brutal winter of 1886. No word of the eggs that sold for 50 cents a dozen when everyone else had nothing. It doesn't mention Mrs. Haskell, who had predicted her death and lived to see her success, but the people who were there remembered. They told their children, and their children told theirs. The story survived even after the coop was filled in and the store was sold, and Emmeline herself was buried beside her first husband and her second. Some stories end with the protagonist becoming famous. This one ends with something better. A woman who dug a hole in the ground, put her chickens in it, and laid the foundation for a life that lasted 60 more years. Emmeline Porter buried her husband on a Tuesday in October, in a grave she dug herself. There was no one else to do it. That desperate act of self-reliance became the foundation for a thriving life. It spread across the county, then across the prairie. It birthed a widespread innovation. Ingenuity, when it's rooted in understanding how the world actually works. If this story of underground eggs resonated with you, subscribe for more narratives of forgotten cleverness. By the 3rd night of the Whitehorn Blizzard, Redwash Basin had vanished. Wind tore across the flats at more than 95 kilometers per hour. The cold had fallen to minus 34 degrees Celsius. Snow buried fence posts and erased the line between earth and sky. At Coldwater Reach, one section of the willow windbreak snapped loose. Harlan Vexley tied a rope around his waist and placed the other end in Maribel Weather's hands. If the wall failed, wind would strike the off-center barn entrance and pack the doorway shut. Inside, Eli counted marker posts through the whiteout. Nell cried behind the canvas curtain. A milk cow strained in early labor. Noah Pike, the hand who had mocked Harlan's work, lay exhausted beside the stove. The rope jerked once. Then, nothing. 6 weeks earlier, Harlan Vexley reached Coldwater Reach with an old handcart and 2 children. He was 39 years old, but the trail had already worn him past that. His coat was patched with 2 different kinds of cloth. One hand pulled the cart, the other carried 10-month-old Nell against his shoulder. 7-year-old Eli walked beside the wheel without once asking how much farther. Harlan had spent years repairing barns, freight wagons, hand pumps, and storage sheds along Union Pacific supply stations. Then his wife Lydia died from childbed fever 6 months ago. He couldn't travel with a repair crew anymore, not while raising 2 children alone. 3 ranches had already turned him away. One offered work but refused the children. Another gave them a bed for one night, then sent them back onto the road. A third suggested Nell would be better off with another family. Harlan walked away. On their last day before reaching the ranch, Nell could only be calmed with thin grain porridge. Eli quietly tucked half his cornbread deep inside his coat even after his father promised there would be food tomorrow. Harlan saw it. The boy no longer believed in tomorrow. Then Coldwater Reach appeared beyond a wind-scoured rise. Mara Bellwether stood beside the stock trough, breaking a thin sheet of early ice with the back of a hammer. Her sleeves were rolled above her elbows. A feed ledger rested beneath her belt. One leather glove had been worn smooth by years of holding reins. Nothing about her suggested someone waiting to be rescued. "What kind of work do you know?" she asked. Harlan answered without offering his story. Barn frames, hand pumps, water troughs, wagon wheels, roofs, doors, hay storage. He paused. "Give my kids milk. Let us sleep somewhere out of the wind. I'll fix what winter is about to break. Mara glanced toward her barn. What makes you think anything is broken? Harlan raised one hand toward the buildings beyond the fence. Your barn doors face the northwest wind. Your hay is pulling moisture from the ground. That water line will freeze before the first real cold front. Silence settled between them. Confidence was easy to find on the frontier. Proof was not. Mara looked at Eli. Then she looked at Nell, still resting against Harlan's shoulder. She stepped forward without answering his claims. Instead, she gently lifted the little girl from his trembling arms. The milk comes first, she said quietly. Your claims can wait until morning. Mara led them into the kitchen without another word. She warmed fresh cow's milk with a little water, tested the temperature against the inside of her wrist, and nodded toward Harlan. Slowly, she said. Her stomach has been empty too long. A bowl of beef stew appeared in front of Eli. Cornbread, dried apples. Another bowl waited for Harlan, even after he quietly insisted he wasn't hungry. Eli ate without speaking. Before finishing, he slid the leftover bread into his pocket. Mara noticed. She didn't say a word. Instead, she laid another piece beside his bowl, as though it had always belonged there. Across the table, Harlan tried to feed Nell, but his hands shook from exhaustion. Mara reached forward and steadied the bottom of the cup without taking the little girl from his arms. Between quiet bites, they exchanged only the facts that mattered. Lydia had died 6 months earlier from childbed fever. Calder Bellwether, Mara's late husband, had been killed 3 winters before a logging wagon sliding off an icy mountain road. Mara never had children. Coldwater Reach was carrying dead after losing 9 head of cattle the previous winter. Later that evening, Mara opened the old foreman's room. From a storage loft, she carried down a cradle. Calder had started it years ago. One rail was still rough, never sanded smooth. Harlan noticed she'd kept it all this time instead of burning it for firewood. That night, Nell slept peacefully in the unfinished cradle. Eli fell asleep with his hand still tightly guarding the hoarded bread in his pocket. The cradle had been waiting for a child who wasn't coming. Now it held one. Before sunrise, Harlan was already walking the ranch. He didn't pick up a hammer. He didn't move a single board. He watched first. A short piece of wool hung beside the barn door. He studied how the wind curled through the opening. He took a shovel and dug into the floor beneath the haystack. The earth beneath the bottom layer was damp. He poured water into one section of the trough and watched how slowly it drained away. Inside the house, a thin line of frost clung to the shrinking chinking between the logs. Outside, old ridges of hardened snow still rested against the fence where the previous winter had piled them. Mara followed without announcing herself. When Harlan finally spoke, he pointed instead of waving his hands. The barn wasn't losing heat because it needed thicker walls. It was losing heat because the wind walked straight through the doors. He knelt beside the hay. This stack was spoiling from the bottom up. Then he pointed toward the pump. The water line was too shallow. It had nowhere to drain after use. His hand rested against the wall of the house. The chinking had pulled away from the logs. Finally, he looked toward the dying row of willow. Those trees were too close. Last winter, the snow drifted exactly where an open doorway needed to be. Mara folded her arms. Calder planted those willows. Harlan shook his head. He wasn't wrong. They work against spring winds. Winter storms come from a different direction. The trees stayed the same. The weather didn't. Some of the tension left her face. Harlan looked across the ranch one more time. 6 weeks. Water first. Hay second. Then the windbreak. The offset entrance. Fresh chinking. Marker posts before the first storm. Mara studied him for a long moment. Then she pointed toward the tool shed. You get 1 week. Then I'll decide whether you see problems or invent them. Harlan started with the jobs least likely to start a fight. The hay came first. Together, he and Mara and Eli lifted away the bottom layers of the stack. A sour smell rose from beneath warm and damp where moisture had been trapped against the ground. Harlan built a raised crib 20 centimeters high from old pine rails already lying behind the shed. Instead of stacking the hay back into one large mound, he divided it into smaller sections and left narrow air channels between them. Eli's job was simple. Measure each gap with a short piece of wood. Count every space out loud. 20 centimeters, Harlan said. The boy did it without being told twice. It was the most words he had spoken since arriving. Next came the water line. Harlan opened a test trench and found the pipe buried only a little deeper than 60 centimeters. "It should be 1.4 meters here," he said, "and it needs enough fall to empty itself after every use." Mara studied the trench. "We don't have time to dig the whole line." "Then we don't," Harlan answered. "We protect the stretch between the well and the milk cows first." No argument, just a shorter plan. Late that afternoon, Ruth Fenley stopped by, an elderly neighboring ranch widow who quietly watched over families across the basin. She brought fresh goat's milk and quiet news. "Silas Greeley has been asking about Mara's new man." Nobody answered. Ruth set 2 loaves of bread on the table, then noticed the bread Eli had saved peeking out of his pocket. She looked toward Mara. "Should I leave 1 loaf?" Mara shook her head. "Leave 2. That evening, Harlan handed Mara a short list. Every item that could be reused had been marked first. Everything that truly needed buying came last. The smallest, cheapest fixes first, that was the pattern. And Mara had just signaled something beyond the 1-week trial. She didn't have to leave 2 loaves, but she did. By the 3rd day, stakes marked the outline of Harlan's new windbreak across the open ground. It would stand 10 meters northwest of the barn, not in front of it, not against it. Far enough to weaken the wind before it reached the buildings. The frame formed an L shape. At its tallest point, it would rise 2.2 meters. Lodgepole pine carried the weight. Willow branches were woven between the posts, but never tightly enough to stop every gust. Sod and brush anchored the base. The shorter arms shielded the path between the house and the barn. Harlan and Eli were driving another post when a horse stopped beside the fence. Silas Greeley, the largest ranch owner in Red Wash Basin and Mara's longtime rival, climbed down without greeting anyone. Years earlier, after Calder Bellwether died, Silas had offered to buy Coldwater Reach for a price Mara refused. Ever since then, he had spoken about the ranch as though its failure were only a matter of time. He looked over the growing frame and smiled. "So this is Vexley's willow wall." His boot nudged one of the posts. "All it'll do is catch snow and bury your barn." Harlan rested both hands on the post driver. "If I build it too close, you're right." Silas frowned. "If the distance matters more than the wall," he turned toward Mara. "Since when did a drifter become your engineer?" Mara never looked away from the survey stakes. "He is not a drifter," she said calmly. "He is my foreman until the work proves otherwise." The words surprised everyone, even Harlan. Silas let out a quiet laugh. "You'll still need my freight road once winter closes in." "If you have business to discuss," Mara replied, "put it in writing." Silas climbed back into the saddle. As he gathered the reins, he looked once more at the unfinished wall. "Winter will decide which one of us is wasting time." He rode away without another word. Eli watched until the horse disappeared over the rise. Then he looked up at his father. "What if he's right?" Harlan picked up the next willow pole. "Then we'll change it before the snow does." The first hard squall hit sooner than anyone expected. Harlan had tied narrow strips of cloth to the willow posts before the wind reached the ranch. He wanted to see how the air actually moved instead of guessing. The answer came within minutes. The center of the windbreak was too tight. The wind climbed over it, rolled downward, and slammed into the ground behind the wall. Thin snow and dry grass began drifting toward the barn entrance. One woven willow panel snapped loose. An old milk cow balked at the temporary passage and nearly tore a hinge from the gate. Harlan never defended the mistake. He cut away nearly a fifth of the willow from the middle section. Mara studied the moving cloth strips for a moment. "Try weaving the next pieces on a diagonal," she said. "Let the wind spread instead of fighting one flat wall." They worked until sunset. When the next gust came, it passed through the willow, slowed, and lost its force before reaching the barn. Harlan nodded toward the fluttering cloth. "A windbreak that stops everything becomes another cliff. The wind only needs to lose its strength." The offset entrance revealed another flaw. The turn was too sharp. The old cow refused the dark corner. Mara measured the passage with her eyes. "We widen it." They moved the gate, opened the angle, and hung a lantern where the shadows had frightened the cattle. As darkness settled over Coldwater Reach, Mara handed Harlan the willow cutters. "Your wall," she said. She looked at the cloth still dancing in the evening wind. "My wind." Then she smiled. "Just enough to be noticed. We fix both." The windbreak worked now, but the real storm hadn't arrived, and a new character was already riding toward the ranch, a county livestock inspector with harder questions than any wind could ask. A week later, a new rider crossed the basin. Edwin March was the county livestock inspector. He didn't come to offer help. He came because he'd heard a woman was rebuilding her barn before winter and that a stranger was doing the work. March never laughed. He asked questions instead. A tighter barn traps moisture, he said. Deep bedding builds ammonia. A hay crib heats from the inside if the air doesn't move. A homemade water line pulls dirt back into the trough. And that canvas curtain is only safe if it stays clear of the stove. Harlan listened, didn't interrupt, didn't defend. They walked the barn together, checked the ridge vent, tested the bedding by hand, measured the warmth inside the haystack, inspected the distance between the canvas and the stovepipe, examined the drain valve beneath the water line. Before leaving, March made one request. 3 weeks of records, morning and evening temperatures. Firewood used. Hay fed. Barn moisture. Every time you break ice, Mara hung a ledger beside the kitchen door. March pointed to the pipe where it passed through the wall. That section could become a cold bridge. Harlan nodded. I'll box it with dry wool and wood. March said it plainly. I don't believe your system will work. Harlan answered without offense. You should not. He looked toward the unfinished ranch. Not until it does. Mara handed a pencil to Eli. Write today's numbers, she said. The boy carefully marked the first line in the ledger. From that morning on, facts would speak before opinions ever could. But the ledger takes time to fill, and the cold doesn't wait for proof. The first batch of chinking failed. Harlan had mixed too much clay into the mortar. After 2 cold nights, the fresh seams shrank away from the logs. Fine cracks appeared. A strip of wool held against the wall still fluttered in the draft. Without complaint, he reached for his scraper. We'll start over. Mara stopped him. My father used to seal sheep sheds, she said. Calder learned from him. Less clay, more animal hair, more rye, straw. Scratch the first layer before finishing the second. Harlan nodded. They mixed another batch. This one gripped the logs instead of pulling away. Later, while searching the storage loft, he found an old canvas roll. The leather stitching along its edges was still intact. Lydia made this, he said quietly. We used it as a draft curtain in a freight camp. He started measuring where to cut it. You don't have to, Mara said. Together, they hung the entire canvas between the sleeping room and the main room without removing a single stitch. As they worked, Harlan spoke of Lydia for the first time. She never feared the cold, but she always checked a child's wrist before she checked the fire. She could sew a tighter leather seal than most men could build with wood. Mara smiled faintly. Calder always set 2 tin cups beside the stove every morning. The next morning, 2 cups stood there again. Neither of them mentioned why. That evening, the room held its warmth far longer than before. Harlan rested his hand on Lydia's old leather stitching for a moment, then quietly let it go. The canvas stayed exactly where it belonged, but the past couldn't fix everything. And there was a subtler failure brewing, one that would freeze before anyone saw it coming. The first real cold snap arrived before anyone expected it. By sunrise, the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees above 0 Fahrenheit. It was the first honest test of everything they had built. The old barn had once struggled to stay above 19 degrees, with cold drafts crossing the floor all day long. Now, behind the willow windbreak and the offset entrance, the milk barn held between 30 and 33 degrees whenever the inner doors stayed closed. The house burned only 5 armloads of firewood instead of 7. The bedding stayed dry. The space beneath the raised crib smelled clean instead of sour. Then the water stopped. The buried line remained open, but the metal coupling beside the trough froze solid. Edwin March had been right. The pipe where it crossed into the open air had become a cold bridge. Harlan grabbed an axe and broke the ice away. I missed it. No excuse in his voice. Together, he and Mara lowered the drain valve, built a small wooden box around the coupling, packed it with dry wool waste, wrapped the outside in tarred cloth, and left enough airspace to keep moisture from collecting inside. They worked until nearly midnight. Mara walked out carrying 2 tin cups filled with hot chicory coffee. Harlan accepted one without lifting his eyes. I said I'd fix this ranch. You did. The water still froze. Mara blew across the steam before taking a sip. "You promised to fix it," she said quietly. "You never promised to guess right the first time." The words stayed with him longer than the coffee. The next morning, they filled the trough again. The water flowed. When the cattle finished drinking, the line emptied itself exactly as planned. For the first time, Harlan understood something that had nothing to do with pipes or winter. Mara was not measuring him by whether he ever failed. She was measuring him by whether he stayed until the failure was gone. For 3 weeks, the ledger filled one careful line at a time. Every morning, Eli wrote the temperature down. Mara added the armloads of firewood, the hay fed to the cattle, the milk collected, the moisture in the bedding, every time the trough needed breaking. The numbers slowly formed their own argument. Nearly 2 fewer armloads of wood disappeared on cold days. Hay use dropped almost 20%. Milk stayed steady, and since the water line had been repaired, the trough had not frozen once. Edwin March returned. He read every page before closing the ledger. "I wouldn't call it proven," he said, "but it's doing exactly what it should." Later that afternoon, Silas Greeley rode in. "When the snow comes," he said, "my freight road closes unless you sign spring water rights over to my herd." "No," Mara answered. Silas shrugged. "A few cold nights aren't winter." He rode away without looking back. Harlan said nothing. After Silas disappeared, he asked only one question. How many days of hay if his road stays closed? 19 by the old numbers, Mara replied. Longer if the ledger is right. Harlan studied the gray sky. We prepare for 26. Without another word, Mara opened the ledger. She wrote 26 beneath the last entry and drew a single line beneath it. From that moment forward, the ranch would prepare for the winter they hoped would never come. The sky began changing 3 days before the storm arrived. At noon, Juniper turned her back to the northwest wind and refused to graze. The air grew heavy, low clouds stretched across the basin in long gray bands. Just before sunset, the wind died without warning. The birds disappeared. Harlan and Mara stopped talking about improvements. Now they prepared for survival. Marker posts went into the ground every 5.5 meters. The cistern was filled to the top. Hay was moved closer to the barn while keeping the air channels open. Every rope on the willow windbreak was checked again. The milk cows and young calves were moved into the protected section. Extra lanterns were hung inside the offset entrance. A guide rope was tied from the house to the barn. A repair bag waited beside the door. Eli watched the last marker post disappear into the frozen ground. Why do we need both the rope and the posts? Harlan tightened another knot. A rope keeps a man from drifting. Posts tell him whether he's still going somewhere. While searching the shed, Mara found an old stake bearing Calder's hand-cut mark. She carried it to the first position nearest the house. Harlan quietly reinforced the repair bag with a leather strap Lydia had sewn years before. Nothing useful was left behind. That evening, Ruth Fenley stopped on her way south to stay with relatives until the storm passed. She left frothy goat's milk on the table. Her eyes paused on the 2 tin cups beside the stove, but she said nothing. Near dusk, a written warning arrived from Edwin March. An Arctic front was pushing south. Winds could exceed 95 kilometers per hour. Once the snow began, no one should leave shelter. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. Now the ranch would wait for the only judge that mattered. The Whitehorn blizzard arrived before dawn. The first blast came from the northwest, exactly as Harlan had predicted. The willow windbreak bent, but held. Snow gathered where it was supposed to well away from the barn doors. The offset entrance broke the direct force of the wind before it reached the cattle. The cistern stayed open beneath its cover. The trough filled, then drained itself before the pipe could freeze. Behind Lydia's canvas curtain, the children's sleeping room held its warmth. Harlan and Mara crossed between the house and the barn one at a time, clipped to the guide rope. By midday, one marker post disappeared beneath drifting snow. The next one still showed its fluttering strip of cloth. Late that afternoon, a dull pounding echoed beyond the windbreak. Harlan followed the line of posts into the white darkness. He found Noah Pike half buried beside the next marker. The horse was gone. His cheeks were white with frostbite. He had lost Silas Greeley's crew hours earlier. "I saw the cloth," Noah whispered. "That's why I kept walking. The storm is only halfway through and the hardest test hasn't come yet." Subscribe. The next few minutes will show you whether Harlan's preparations were enough to save a life that wasn't even supposed to be here. The storm tightened its grip overnight. The temperature dropped again. Before sunrise, Maple, the oldest, milk cow, went into labor, weeks too early. Mara took one look and knew. The calf was turned. Dr. Amos Keene served every ranch across Redwash Basin. He could not reach Coldwater Reach. Snow had buried the roads. There would be no help beyond the people already inside the barn. Harlan checked the water line in the windbreak. Mara washed her hands with warm water. Tied Maple's tail aside, found the calf's front legs. Worked slowly with the boiled calving straps, exactly as Amos had shown her once. Eli held the lantern. His hands shook. "Look at her eyes," Mara said softly. He obeyed. Harlan returned just as the final pull was needed. The calf slid onto the dry straw. It did not breathe. Mara cleared its mouth. Harlan rubbed its ribs with clean straw. Without being asked, Eli placed a dry towel into Mara's hand. The warm water came from the protected line. Clean hands. The dry bedding came from the raised crib. The newborn lay on a floor that wasn't frozen. The offset entrance held the wind outside the calving stall. Running water meant clean instruments. The lantern in the widened passage kept the cattle calm. Every small fix made this moment possible. For one long moment, nothing happened. Then the calf drew its first breath. Everyone stopped moving. From the house, Nell began to cry. Still weak from the day before, Noah pulled the unfinished cradle closer to the stove, quietly warmed another bottle of milk. No one stood outside the work anymore. Eli finally let out the breath he had been holding since the calf fell into the straw. The boy who stopped believing in tomorrow had just watched tomorrow arrive. But the storm was not finished. The third day would bring the hardest wind yet. The third day brought the hardest wind. Just after noon, one of the lashings on the north section of the willow windbreak snapped. The woven panel shook violently. If it failed, the wind would pour straight through the offset passage. Snow would bury the barn entrance. Within hours, the cattle could be sealed inside. Harlan reached for the rope. Mara caught the other end without a word. Outside, the storm erased everything beyond the next marker post. Harlan crawled from stake to stake. One post had already snapped. The loose willow lattice slammed into him, knocking him flat into the snow. His repair bag burst open, tools scattered across the drift. Only Lydia's old leather strap kept the bag from blowing away. Inside the barn, Maple bellowed. Nell cried from the house. Mara gripped the rope with both hands. Then she felt 3 sharp tugs. Their signal. Give line. She fed more rope into the storm. Harlan reached the broken section and braced it with a spare willow pole, setting it across the frame instead of rebuilding the wall. It did not need to last forever, only until morning. The rope finally grew still. Mara pulled. A figure crawled out of the white darkness on one arm and one knee. Harlan pushed himself upright. It will hold until morning. Mara looked past him at the storm still raging across the basin. Morning is enough. By the 4th morning, the wind had begun to weaken. Nobody celebrated. They just started counting. Every Maine animal was still alive. The newborn calf carried only a small patch of frostbite on one ear. The bedding was dry. Water still flowed through the trough. The hay crib showed no heat, no spoilage. The barn doors opened without digging through snow. Firewood still sat stacked beside the stove. And Noah Pike stood on his own 2 feet again. Harlan walked the ranch with a notebook. Not relief. One brace had been too light. 2 marker posts needed to be set deeper. The outer cloth strips would need stronger stitching. The wooden cover over the water coupling needed a better roof. Mara watched him write. You've counted every weakness before you've counted what survived. Harlan closed the notebook. The living can wait an hour. A weakness should not be allowed to hide behind success. He looked across the battered windbreak. Later, the clouds opened just enough to reveal a strip of gray sky. Steam drifted from the cattle as they breathed into the cold air. The children have their milk, Mara said quietly. Harlan studied the broken section of the willow wall. The ranch still needs fixing. Neither of them spoke about spring. Neither of them spoke about leaving. That evening, Mara placed Harlan's dry gloves beside the 2 tin cups waiting near the stove. She set them there as naturally as though they had always belonged. When the roads finally opened, people came to Coldwater Reach for answers instead of rumors. Edwin March arrived first. Dr. Amos Keene followed. Then came neighboring ranchers who had spent 4 days digging cattle from snowdrifts. March inspected everything without hurry. He checked the barn temperature, felt the bedding with his bare hand, examined the water system, counted the surviving cattle, measured the remaining hay. and read every page of the ledger from the first 3 weeks before the storm to the last entry written during it. At last, he closed the book. The barn stayed drier. The herd burned less feed than expected. Stable water made the difference. The windbreak stood where the snow wanted to settle, not where the doors needed to open. And every flaw you found early was corrected before the blizzard arrived. Noah spoke next. I'd be dead if those marker posts hadn't been there. Silas Greeley came last. His ranch had lost cattle. Part of his north barn roof had been torn away. He offered no apology. Instead, he looked toward the willow wall. How far did you set it from the barn? 10.5 meters through the middle, Harlan answered. Then we adjusted for the ground. And you never weave it tight enough to stop the wind completely. Silas nodded once. Show me. Harlan walked beside him across the snow without another word. Later, after the last hoofbeat faded and the visitors had finally gone, Mara led Harlan into the ranch office. She placed a folded agreement on the desk. It granted him a share of the profits, authority over water systems, structural work, winter preparation. One final line stood apart from the rest. Eli and Nell would always have a home at Coldwater Reach, regardless of what happened between the two adults. Harlan looked up. Why would you give me part of something that has always belonged to you? Mara met his eyes without hesitation. I'm not giving you what was mine. She turned the agreement toward him. I'm naming what you already carried. That evening, they sat beside the stove while the ranch settled into its first quiet night since the blizzard. The fire burned low. Neither of them hurried to fill the silence. At last, Harlan looked into his cup. I came here asking for milk. I never meant to owe you a life. Mara rested both hands around her coffee. You don't owe me one, but there is one here if you mean to share it. Harlan smiled for the first time in months. I'll stay until the snow is gone. Mara looked toward the window where patches of ice still clung to the fence. Stay until the grass comes back. He lifted his eyes. Longer than that. They didn't marry as soon as the roads reopened. The work came first. In the weeks that followed, they focused on rebuilding the broken windbreak. Under Harlan's guidance, neighboring ranches, even Silas Greeley, quietly adopted the Coldwater winter plan. It wasn't until early May that Harlan and Mara held a quiet wedding. Dr. Amos and Inspector March stood as witnesses. The celebration lasted only long enough to sign the papers. Maple was calving again. Silas never attended. But a neat bundle of straight willow stakes, resting beside the fence, served as a silent blessing. A few days after the wedding, Eli was bent over the ledger. He looked up. Do I have to call you something else now? Mara smiled. You never have to call me anything you don't truly mean. Eli thought about it. Mara. For her, that was enough. But weeks later, he stumbled near the marker posts. The word came out before he could stop it. Ma Mara. She was at his side in 3 steps, brushing dirt from his hands. She pretended not to hear the word. He almost finished. Spring came slow. Beside the barn post where Eli had just carved a new snow line, little Nell took her first unsteady steps across the yard. Her tiny voice drifted through the air. Ma. Mara didn't rush forward. She just knelt, waiting. Let the girl finish the last few steps on her own. Harlan stood at the edge of the yard. His eyes moved across the repaired windbreak, the open barn doors, the cattle grazing in the new grass. And it still needs fixing. Mara handed him the second tin cup. That's a good thing. You said you'd stay as long as there was work. Coldwater Reach didn't survive because winter showed mercy. Winter showed none. It survived because every weakness was fixed before the storm could exploit it. The unfinished cradle was filled. The family was rebuilt not by replacing what was lost, but by adding what was needed. Subscribe if this kind of story is your thing. I find one every few weeks. And drop a comment. What's one thing you've seen that was built to last, not because it was perfect, but because someone kept fixing it? The wind didn't just blow, it screamed. For 19 days, it had howled without stopping. In the small town of Cedar Bluff, Kansas, every last sack of flour had vanished 3 weeks earlier. The merchant, Cornelius Whitfield, had sold it for $4 a sack, 10 times the usual price. People paid it because hunger makes men generous with money they can't eat. Now, even Whitfield's shelves stood empty. The supply trains from the east were buried under 12-foot drifts, somewhere between Topeka and eternity. Cedar Bluff was learning a hard lesson. Winter was not a season, it was a predator, and it was hunting them. Then, on that frozen Valentine's morning, something impossible drifted through the bitter air. It was faint at first, carried on the knife-edge wind. People dismissed it as a trick of memory, or maybe madness. But the scent grew stronger. It became undeniable, the warm, yeasty perfume of fresh-baked bread. Strong men wept at the smell. Children pressed their faces to frost-covered windows, not trusting their own noses. One by one, the starving citizens of Cedar Bluff followed that sacred scent. They walked through the snow, past the frozen creek, up the low hill on the edge of town. They went to the home of the woman they had called Mad. Louisa Mercer stood in her doorway. Flour dusted her apron. She held a steaming golden loaf in her bare hands. Behind her, from a passage cut into the hillside, more of that precious aroma poured forth like a promise. The underground bakery they had mocked for 2 years was the only thing standing between Cedar Bluff and starvation. Spring of 1884. That's when Louisa Mercer arrived in Cedar Bluff. She came with little more than a wagon, a strawberry roan mare named Clover, and the memory of bread. Louisa was 38, a widow. Her husband had died of cholera 3 years earlier, on a steamboat. He left her with some savings, but no children. Before she married, she was Louisa Ashworth, daughter of Henrik Ashworth, St. Louis's finest baker. She grew up with flour under her fingernails. The rhythm of kneading was in her bones. Her father taught her everything, the sacred mysteries of sourdough, the patience a proper rise needed. How a good loaf speaks to you if you know how to listen. After her husband died, she drifted west. She was looking for purpose. Cedar Bluff, Kansas, seemed like a good place to start over. The town was new. It was growing. It had cattle, money, and ambition. There was a general store, a church, a schoolhouse, and a saloon, but there was no bakery. Bread came in 2 ways. You could buy whatever the general store had. It was usually stale and hard as oak. Or the women of the town made it themselves. Their results varied. Louisa saw a chance to build something, but she also saw something else. Something the optimistic settlers of Cedar Bluff refused to acknowledge. She saw how exposed they were. The town sat on open prairie. No natural windbreaks, no forests for firewood, only one supply line that ran back east. She had lived through harsh winters in St. Louis. She had heard old-timers speak of winters further west. Their voices held a particular kind of fear. Cedar Bluff was betting its future on mild weather. They assumed the trains would always run. They believed civilization would keep the wilderness away. Louisa Mercer knew better. Civilization was a thin veneer. Winter had no respect for it. Louisa had a different kind of vision. She found a small piece of land at the edge of town on a south-facing hill. Other settlers had ignored it. It was too rocky, too steep, too hard to farm. She paid $12 for it. Cornelius Whitfield, who wanted that land for his own plans, just laughed. $12 for a pile of rocks, he told the men at his store. The widow has more money than sense. Louisa started to dig. Her plan, sketched out in a worn leather journal from her journey west, called for an underground bakehouse. She would cut into that south-facing slope. It would be a vaulted room, large enough for a brick oven, space for flour and grain, and a place to work. The earth itself would provide what the Kansas prairie could not: insulation, stability, and protection from the wind. Her father Henrik had told her stories from the old country. Village bakers in Germany built their ovens right into hillsides. It saved fuel and kept temperatures steady. The earth remembers heat, Henrik had said. An oven built into stone and soil will bake better bread with half the wood. But it wasn't just about baking. It was about keeping things safe. Flour left exposed to the wild temperature swings of a Kansas winter would freeze, then thaw, then freeze again. It would be ruined. Yeast, that living miracle that makes bread rise, would die in the bitter cold. But underground, the temperature stayed steady, about 13 degrees Celsius. Flour would keep dry, yeast would live, bread could still be made, even when the world above had surrendered to ice. Digging was hard for a woman working alone, but Louisa had Clover. The strawberry roan mare was not young, but she was strong. She was patient. Louisa built a simple sled. Together, they pulled rock and soil out of the growing hole. The work caught people's eye. At first, it was just curiosity. Then it became a game. Cornelius Whitfield loved to mock people. He led most things in Cedar Bluff. Whitfield was a big man with a red face and a loud voice. He got rich selling supplies to settlers. He charged them prices just below what they could pay. Whitfield controlled everything that came into town. He liked it that way. A bakery threatened his hold on flour and bread. "Have you seen the widow's hole?" he bellowed at his store one June afternoon. "She means to bake bread underground, like some kind of prairie witch. I expect she'll be cooking up potions next." Laughter filled the store. Soon, people called Louisa's project the Witch's Den. Mayor Abernathy was a thin man. Whitfield's money had helped him get elected. The mayor would just shake his head sadly when someone brought up Louisa. "A shame," he would say. "The woman clearly suffers from some disorder of the mind, baking bread in a cave. Has anyone ever heard of such a thing?" The townswomen were just as mean. Mrs. Whitfield, the merchant's wife, invited every woman in Cedar Bluff to her quilting circle. Everyone except Louisa. "We must be careful," she told her friends. "Madness can be catching." Through it all, Louisa kept digging. By August, the main chamber was ready. It was 3.7 meters deep. It was 5.5 meters wide. At its peak, the ceiling was 3 meters high. She reinforced the walls with stones. She hauled them from a dry creek bed. She fitted them together with mortar. She mixed herself, lime, sand, and water. The ceiling formed a gentle arch. It was not as fancy as her father's ovens back in St. Louis, but it was strong. The brick oven was her masterpiece. She bought the bricks from a kiln in Wichita. She spent almost all her remaining money to have them brought in. The oven was built into the back wall of the chamber. Its huge mass was designed to soak up heat from a small fire. Then it would radiate that heat steadily for hours. A stone chimney, angled just right, sent smoke up through the hillside. It did this without letting cold air pour back down. She installed heavy oak shelves for flour. She built tin-lined bins to keep out moisture and pests. Hidden in a small alcove near the oven, where the heat was most steady, Louisa kept a ceramic pot. Inside was her most prized possession, her father's sourdough starter. This starter had been alive for over 60 years. Henrik Ashworth, her father, had brought it from Bavaria as a young man. He kept it going through a long ocean trip, through hard times and good times, through war and peace. He gave Louisa a piece of it on her wedding day. She had kept it alive through everything since then. It was more than yeast, flour, and water. It was memory. It was family. It was proof that life could persist through anything if properly tended. The whole underground bakery, with the land, materials, and those special bricks, cost her $147. She opened for business in September of 1884. A loaf of bread cost 10 cents. That was half what Whitfield charged for his old, dry bread. Louisa's bread was amazing. It had a crisp, golden crust. Inside, it was soft and tangy. Cedar Bluff had never tasted anything like it. Soon, word spread. Families made their way to the Witch's Den, returning with bread that made their neighbors green with envy. Whitfield hated it. He started telling everyone that Louisa's bread was bad for you. He claimed baking underground was dirty. He said no good Christian would eat something from a hole in the ground. He even pushed the mayor to inspect her place, hoping to find a reason to shut her down. But the inspection found nothing wrong. Louisa's underground bakery was cleaner than most kitchens in town. The temperature inside stayed cool and steady. There were no flies, no rats, no mold. Mayor Abernathy looked hard for a reason to close her, but he found none. Still, the town kept its distance. They bought her bread, but they didn't accept her. Louisa sold her loaves, looked after her starter, and kept to herself. She had no friends in Cedar Bluff, except for Clover. But she had her work, and she had her own quiet certainty. The first winter, from 1884 to 1885, passed without much trouble. Trains kept running, supplies came in, and Cedar Bluff felt lucky. Louisa watched the mild weather, but she said nothing. She just kept getting ready. She bought extra grain directly from farmers right after harvest. This went into her underground bins. She also piled up firewood cut and stacked in a shed built against the hill. Louisa wasn't preparing for the winter they were having. She was getting ready for the one that would follow. The summer of 1885 was hot and dry. The wheat harvest was poor, so prices went up. Whitfield, always looking for an advantage, bought what grain he could find and raised his prices even higher. Louisa, who had bought her supplies cheaply the previous autumn, kept her bread at 10 cents a loaf. Whitfield's dislike for her turned into a real hatred. That autumn brought signs that worried Louisa. Geese flew south early in huge honking flocks that seemed to darken the sky. She found woolly caterpillars that were solid black. It might have been an old wives' tale, but her father had always believed in such warnings. Farmer Hoskins, who lived 5 kilometers north and had been on the prairie for 30 years, told anyone who would listen that a killing winter was coming. Nobody listened. They called him a pessimist. They called him a fool. In late October, Louisa doubled her firewood supply. She bought another 90 kilograms of flour from a farmer just passing through, paying cash when everyone else was buying on credit. She checked and rechecked her stores, her sourdough starter, her oven. Clover, her mare, moved into a small stable she had built into the hillside, connected to the bakery by a short passage. The mare would have shelter, warmth, and company through whatever was coming. Then came November. The first snows arrived. Heavy and early. They fell, and they just stayed. December was a brutal month. Temperatures plunged to negative 29 degrees Celsius, and they held there. The wind howled constantly, piling snow into drifts. These buried fences, they swallowed outbuildings. The supply trains, already running only now and then, stopped completely. A blizzard on December 18th piled drifts taller than a man across the tracks. Cedar Bluff was cut off. At first, people weren't too worried. Most families had enough supplies. Christmas passed quietly. Folks rationed what they had. But as January dragged on, the real truth hit them. Flour ran low. The meat was gone. Families who had never known real hunger began to understand what it meant. Whitfield's store became a terrible place. Every morning, a crowd gathered, hoping for news of the trains, hoping for some miracle of new supplies. Every morning, they left with nothing. Whitfield, who had kept the most goods, started selling at outrageous prices. A cup of flour cost $1. A pound of salt pork went for $2. People paid. They had no other choice. By February, even Whitfield's own reserves were gone. His shelves, once a sign of Cedar Bluff's wealth, stood empty. The town was starving. Through all of this, Louisa Mercer kept baking. Her witch's den, that underground room carved into the frozen hillside, stayed at a steady 13 degrees Celsius. The flour in its tin-lined bins remained dry and good. The sourdough starter, fed every day in its warm spot, bubbled with strong life. The brick oven, fueled by the firewood Louisa had carefully stored, gave off a steady, even heat. Every morning before dawn, she would go down into her bakehouse. She would start the fire. Then she began the ancient ritual. Mix the sponge, let it rise, knead the dough, shape the loaves, let them proof, slide them into the oven, wait, listen, and finally take them out at the perfect moment. Their crusts crackled, their insides were soft and steaming. For weeks, she had been quietly taking bread to those she knew were suffering most. There was Widow Patterson, whose husband had died in November, the Hoskins family, whose children looked thin and pale. The elderly Mullers, who had no one to help them. She asked for nothing in return. She simply left the loaves at their doors, wrapped in clean cloth, warm against the killing cold. The town is starving and hopeless. But the source of the impossible scent and Louisa's ultimate choice are about to be revealed. Subscribe to see what happens next. On February 14th, the wind finally shifted. For the first time in weeks, the air grew calm enough to carry a scent. It was the smell of baking bread. It drifted across Cedar Bluff like a visitation. A ragged procession began to gather. Whitfield himself led the way. He hung back, neared the little house, his pride fighting his hunger. Mayor Abernathy was there too, wrapped in a coat that had grown too large for his shrunken frame. Mrs. Whitfield, the woman who had organized the quilting circle that excluded Louisa, clutched her shawl. She would not meet anyone's eyes. Louisa stood in her doorway. Flour dusted her apron. A fresh loaf, still steaming, rested in her hands. Behind her, the passage to the underground bakery glowed with warmth and light. She looked at the people who had mocked her. They had shunned her. They had called her mad. She saw their hollow cheeks. She saw their desperate eyes. And she saw something else. She saw the neighbors she had hoped they might become. "Come in," she said simply. "There's bread enough." They filed in, one by one. They descended into the chamber they had called the witch's den. Inside, they found no darkness, no dread. Instead, there was warmth, there was order, and there was the sacred smell of fresh bread. Loaves lined the shelves. The oven glowed with steady heat. Clover, the mare, nickered softly from her stable nearby. Whitfield was the last to enter. He stood before Louisa. He was a man broken in more ways than one. His fortune, his pride, his certainty, all of it had crumbled. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Louisa handed him a loaf. "Eat, Mr. Whitfield," she said. "Bread is meant to be shared." He took it with trembling hands. For a long moment, he simply held it. He felt its warmth. He smelled its life. Then, quietly, he spoke. "I mocked you," he said. "I tried to ruin you. I called you mad and worse. And yet you—" He could not finish. "I baked bread," Louisa said. "That is all. That is what I know how to do. The rest, the cruelty, the unkindness that belongs to yesterday. Today, we eat. Tomorrow we begin again." The bread of that long winter became a legend in Cedar Bluff. Louisa baked every day, offering loaves to anyone who came to her door. She never asked for payment. Many still insisted, leaving promissory notes, a piece of jewelry, or a promise of labor in the spring. When the thaw finally arrived in late March, the first supply train chugged into the makeshift station. Cedar Bluff had lost only 3 people to the brutal winter. All of them were elderly, already sick before the snows began. It was a miracle. Neighboring towns had not been so lucky. Whole families had died. Entire communities vanished from the map. Cedar Bluff survived because a woman they called a witch baked bread in a hole in the ground. The town faced a reckoning in April. Mayor Abernathy called a meeting. He stood before the assembly, a changed man. His voice was steady, but humble. "We owe this town's survival to one person," he said. "A woman we shunned, a woman we mocked, a woman who, when we had nothing, gave us everything." He turned to Louisa, sitting quietly in the back. "Mrs. Mercer, I speak for all of us when I say we were wrong, profoundly, shamefully wrong, and we are grateful beyond any words I possess." Then Whitfield rose. The bluster was gone from him. In its place was something quieter, something that might have been wisdom. "I have been a proud man," he said, "a greedy man. I charged my neighbors $4 for flour that cost me 20 cents. I hoarded when I should have shared. When the worst came, I had nothing to offer but empty shelves." He looked at Louisa. "You built something I could never understand. Not just a bakery, but a gift. A gift to people who had given you nothing but scorn." He paused. "I would like to learn, if you would teach me, if you would teach us all." Louisa stood. The room fell silent. "My father used to say that bread is the oldest kindness," she said. "Flour and water and time, transformed by heat into something that sustains life. It asks nothing of the one who eats it. It simply nourishes." She looked around the room at the faces of her neighbors. Faces that had once turned away from her now looked at her with something like hope. "I will teach anyone who wishes to learn," she said. "Not because you have earned it, but because bread is meant to be shared, and so is knowledge." That summer, 3 more underground bakeries appeared in the hills around Cedar Bluff. Louisa oversaw each one. She taught the women, and some of the men, the secrets of sourdough. To each new bakery, she gave a piece of her father's starter. It was a living connection to the old country, to old ways. It was the wisdom that had kept her going. Soon, a new phrase entered the local talk. Digging a Mercer. It meant building something others didn't understand. It meant getting ready for trouble no one else wanted to see. People said it with respect, even reverence. Cornelius Whitfield closed his general store in 1887. He had lost too much in money and in spirit to keep it open. But he found a new path. He became Louisa's apprentice. At 52, he started learning the baker's craft. He never truly mastered it, but he found peace in the work, in the simple rhythm of flour, water, and fire. Louisa Mercer lived to be 81 years old. She died quietly in the spring of 1927. She never married again. But she was never alone. The children of Cedar Bluff knew her as Grandmother Bread. Her funeral was the largest the town had ever seen. Her underground bakery still stands today. It's now a historical site. Visitors go down into that cool, dim room. They try to imagine it, the smell of fresh bread rising up through the frozen earth, a small miracle in a world of ice. On the wall, someone carved a simple message long ago. It reads, "Bread is the oldest kindness." The wind had howled for 19 days that winter, but Louisa's quiet foresight answered it. Her warmth and her bread turned a predator into a provider. True resilience, true community salvation, often comes from those dismissed as mad. Their preparation for unseen hardships proves to be the ultimate wisdom. If stories like these resonate with you, subscribe for more and drop a comment. What old technique do you think we've forgotten that still has a use nobody's seen yet? The iron stoves in Ironwood, Dakota Territory glowed cherry red, but the rooms they were supposed to heat stayed brutally cold. This wasn't just another January cold snap. It was the kind of deep freeze that turned stacked wood into ash faster than anyone thought possible. The Lindgren family, who owned Ironwood's biggest store, burned a week's worth of wood in just 2 days. The Hendersons had 4 small children. They were already breaking up furniture to keep their fire going. Even Reverend Hoskins emptied the church woodshed, then started burning the pews, sure that God would understand. Everyone was freezing. Everyone was running out of fuel. They watched their cast iron stoves devour everything they had, giving back heat that vanished the moment the fire died down. Everyone, that is, except for Antti Korhonen. The Finnish immigrant sat in his small cabin on the edge of the settlement. He wore shirt sleeves and read a book by lamplight, the same brutal cold that threatened his neighbors pressed against his walls. It found no way in. His stove, if you could even call it that, was not glowing. It was not roaring. The fire he had lit that morning had died down to coals hours ago, yet the massive stone structure in the middle of his cabin steadily radiated warmth. It felt like the fire still blazed inside. He had loaded it once that morning. He wouldn't need to load it again until evening. 12 hours of gentle heat from a single firing. Meanwhile, his neighbors fed their hungry iron beasts every 30 minutes. They still shivered in their beds. Antti Korhonen came to America in the spring of 1879. He was 27, unmarried, a stonemason's son from eastern Finland. Winters there lasted 8 months. Survival depended on knowledge passed down for 1,000 years. In Finland, people did not heat their homes with cast iron boxes. These boxes ate wood like starving wolves. Instead, they used something different. They called it a peruni, or simply the stove in his village. This was a massive structure. It used stone or brick built around a firebox. A series of channels captured the heat. This heat then stored itself in tons of thermal mass. You burned a hot fire for an hour or 2. Then the stone itself became the heat source. It radiated warmth for 12, 15, even 20 hours, all from a single firing. The physics were simple. Cast iron conducts heat quickly. It gets hot fast. It radiates that heat into a room. It cools just as quickly when the fire dies. Stone is the opposite. It absorbs heat slowly. It stores that heat in its mass. It releases it gradually over many hours. A cast iron stove needed constant feeding. It needed it to maintain temperature. A stone stove needed one good fire, then it needed time for the stones to do their work. It offered 12 to 20 hours of steady warmth, all from a single loading. The settlers had laughed at his stove during construction. They called it a monument to foreign foolishness. A waste of good stone. They said it would never throw heat like proper American cast iron. Horace Wheeler, who owned the general store, watched Antti build. He considered himself the arbiter of sensible behavior in Ironwood. "The Finn is building a castle for his stove," he observed. Someone should tell him that stoves come from the foundry, not the quarry. Antti worked slowly, methodically. While other settlers built quick wooden frames, he started not with walls, but with a foundation. He hauled granite 16 kilometers from an outcropping. He mixed mortar from lime. He burned himself. It took him 3 months to build. The finished stove was massive, 1.8 meters tall, 2.4 meters long, 1.2 meters wide. It dominated his single cabin room like a small monument. The firebox was lined with fire brick he had bought from a specialty supplier in Street Paul. This was one of his few concessions to American commerce. Inside, channels carried hot gases from the firebox through the stone mass. It was a pattern his father had perfected. Baffles forced the heat through as much stone as possible. By the time smoke left the chimney, it was barely warm. The stone had absorbed all its heat. That autumn, settlers visited. They were curious, but skeptical. Martha Wheeler touched the stone surface. "It is cold," she declared. "Your stove is cold, Mr. Corhonen. How is a cold stove supposed to heat anything?" Auntie tried to explain. His English was limited. He spoke of gentle, constant warmth that felt comfortable for humans, not fierce and fleeting. He convinced no one. The cold stove became a joke, a symbol of the Finn's foolishness, his refusal to accept the American cast iron way. The first winter came for ironwood, 1882 to 1883. It proved Auntie's design, though nobody really paid attention. He fired his stove twice a day, once in the morning, then again in the evening. He burned hot fires, the kind that would warp and crack a cast iron box. Then he closed the damper. The fire died down to coals. His cabin stayed warm for 12 hours, steady and constant, needing no more wood or fuss. He used perhaps 1/3 of the wood his neighbors burned. His home was never cold, never too hot. It was always comfortable. The stone released its stored heat slowly, perfectly matching the rate the cabin walls lost heat to the outside. It was elegant. It was efficient. And it was completely invisible to people who had already made up their minds. The next winters, 1883, 1884, and 1885 followed the same pattern. Auntie lived in quiet comfort. His neighbors struggled, burned more wood, and still shivered. The joke about the cold stove continued. It was repeated by people who had never spent a single night in his cabin. They never felt the gentle warmth that radiated from stone, which held hours of heat in its mass. If you find yourself drawn to stories about overlooked wisdom, subscribe. The real test for ironwood was still building, and it was going to be brutal. January of 1886 brought a cold unlike anything ironwood had ever known. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. They stayed there, day after day, without a break. The wind howled, pushing the effective temperature even lower. It was cold enough to kill livestock in minutes. Even inside their homes, humans were not safe. The cast iron stoves of ironwood fought hard. They glowed cherry red, burning through wood at an incredible pace. But the colder it got, the faster heat escaped through every wall, every window, every tiny crack. The stoves demanded more and more wood. The stockpiles dwindled. By the third day, families began rationing fuel. On the fifth day, they started burning furniture. By the seventh, the math was clear. There was not enough wood left in ironwood to keep every cast iron stove fed until the cold broke. The first death came on January 18th. Old Silas Ricks lived alone at the edge of the settlement. His stove went cold sometime in the night. His arthritic hands could no longer split kindling fast enough to keep the fire alive. They would not find him until spring, frozen in his chair, his wood box empty beside him. The crisis had arrived. But in his cabin, Auntie Corhonen remained warm. He burned his stove twice a day. He could have stayed in comfort. He could have let the people who mocked him face the consequences. But children were shivering in those cabins. They might die because their parents were too proud to learn from a foreigner. Auntie could not let that happen. Auntie walked into ironwood on the morning of January 19th. The cold felt like fire in his lungs with every breath. He went straight to the Wheeler store. All the town leaders were already there, trying to figure out what to do. "My cabin," Auntie said. His English was still thick, but clear enough after 7 years in America. "It is warm. The stove. My stone stove. It heats for 12 hours on one load. I have wood enough for the whole winter. Bring the families. Bring the children. There is room." Horace Wheeler just stared. This was the man who had laughed loudest at Auntie's stove. He had made jokes about cold stones for 4 winters. Now, this foolishness was their only hope. "Your stove," Wheeler said slowly. "The stone one. It actually works." "It has always worked," Auntie replied. "You never looked." The evacuation started that afternoon. 37 people crowded into Auntie's cabin over the next few days. Every family who could not keep warm in their own homes. Every person whose wood was gone. Every child whose parents finally put survival above pride. They brought what little fuel they had left, adding to Auntie's supply. They watched in amazement as he showed them the technology they had dismissed for so long. The stone stove took over the cabin. It had a huge presence, sending heat out from every side. Auntie lit it twice a day, letting it burn hot and fast for about an hour each time. Then, he would close the damper. The stone did the rest. The heat that came from it was gentle. It was steady, comfortable. Nothing like the harsh blast from cast iron stoves that would burn your skin if you got too close, leaving the far corners of a room freezing. On the second night, Martha Wheeler asked, her hand resting on the stone, "How is this possible?" The surface was warm, not hot. It felt like a sun-baked rock on a summer afternoon, not something dangerous. "The fire died hours ago. How is it still warm?" Auntie tried to explain it. His English was still a bit rough, but clear enough. "Stone remembers heat," he said. "Iron forgets. Iron gives heat fast, loses fast. Stone holds. Stone gives slow, all night, all day." He gestured at the massive structure. "One fire in morning, one fire in night. Stone does the work between. In Finland, we know this for 500 years. Maybe more. We have cold winters too, our grandfathers learned. Not iron, stone. Stone is patient. Stone keeps you alive." The cold snap lasted 11 days. Auntie's cabin sheltered 37 people through it all. The stove used only 1/5 the fuel a cast iron one would have needed. Children slept warm against walls that radiated gentle heat. Elderly couples found comfort they had not felt in weeks. Families who had mocked the stone stove finally saw what they had missed. 4 people died in ironwood during those 11 days, all in homes heated by cast iron. 37 others survived, sheltered by stone. The cold finally broke in March. Survivors gathered at the Wheeler store, the only building large enough to face the winter that had nearly taken them all. They came to acknowledge what had happened, and the man who had made the difference. Horace Wheeler spoke first. The merchant who once led the mockery, who joked about cold stones for 4 winters, stood before his community. Shame covered his face. 4 years ago, he began, his voice shaky, I stood in this store and laughed at Auntie Korhonen's stove. I called it a monument to foreign foolishness. I said Americans knew better than Finnish peasants. He stopped, struggling for words. I made jokes. This whole settlement repeated them. Those jokes kept anyone from taking seriously a technology that could have saved lives. He paused, then continued. 4 people died this winter. 4 of our neighbors froze in homes heated by cast iron. The American way, the way I insisted, was superior. His gaze shifted to Auntie, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. 37 people survived because they sheltered with the Finn we mocked, warmed by the stone stove I said would never work. He looked back at his community. I was wrong. We were all wrong. People died because we were too proud to learn from someone who knew better than we did. Martha Wheeler spoke next, tears streaming down her face. I felt that stone, she confessed. I decided it could not work because it was not hot like cast iron. I never asked why. I never thought gentle warmth might be better than fierce heat that vanished when the fire died. She wrung her hands. I knew nothing, and I spoke as if I knew everything. Others followed, families who had found refuge in Auntie's cabin, parents whose children had slept warm against radiating stone walls, elderly couples who had found unexpected comfort. One by one, they spoke of their mockery, their pride, and the deaths that might have been prevented. Auntie walked to the center. His English was still accented, his words carefully chosen. But after 4 years of dismissal, he finally had an audience willing to hear. In Finland, he said, we have a saying, Q-usen. The stove keeps memory. He looked around. It means the stones remember the heat you give them. They hold it. They release it slowly. They keep you warm through the long nights. Cast iron has no memory, he continued. It gives what you give. It takes it back when you stop giving. Stone is different. Stone is patient. Stone works while you sleep, while you read, while you do other things. Stone does not demand all your attention every hour of every day. He paused again. I tried to tell you this. You did not listen because I am foreign, because my English is not good. Because you believed Americans know better than Finns. Maybe sometimes Americans do know better, but not about cold. We have had cold for 1,000 years. We know cold, like you know your own children. He gestured toward his cabin, visible through the store window. The stove is still there. It will last 100 years. Stone does not wear out like iron. I will teach anyone who wants to learn how to build such a stove. The knowledge is not secret. The techniques are not difficult. Anyone with stones and patience can have what I have. Then he looked at Horace Wheeler. You have lost 4 neighbors. But you can make sure no one else dies because they trusted iron instead of stone. That is the only thing I ask, that you learn and teach your children so the knowledge passes on. That summer, ironwood transformed. 14 new stone stoves rose across the district. They were massive structures, built from granite and limestone, following Auntie's precise instructions. Each one took weeks to finish, but each one would last generations. They would radiate heat through winters that would devour any cast iron stove. Horace Wheeler built one in his own home. He tore out the cast iron stove that had nearly failed his family. In its place, he put stone. That stone would never fail again. He never made fun of foreign ways after that. He never just assumed American ways were better. He never again dismissed what he did not understand. The phrase building finish entered the language of the Dakota Territory. It spread across the northern plains. It meant building with heavy stone, trusting patience over quick heat. It meant understanding that old ways sometimes knew things the new ways had forgotten. People spoke it with quiet respect. It was as if they understood heat retention only after nearly freezing to death. Auntie Corhonen lived in his cabin for another 43 years. He passed away in the winter of 1929 at 77. He had married in 1890. His wife, Sina, was a widow whose first husband had died in that 1886 cold snap. He had trusted cast iron. Auntie and Sina raised 3 children. All of them learned to build stone stoves before they learned to read. The stove Auntie built in 1882 still stands. The Dakota Historical Society maintains it. It is a monument to a technology that saved a settlement. Visitors feel its gentle warmth. They understand how stone holds heat. They learn what a Finnish immigrant knew, something his community refused to believe. Above the firebox, an inscription is carved in Finnish and English. Ki muista. Stone remembers. The cast iron stoves of Ironwood, Dakota Territory once devoured wood at a rate that would exhaust every stockpile before February. They were replaced by stone stoves. These were built with patience, providing lasting warmth and memory. This ancient, patient technology, rooted in a deep understanding of nature, can outperform and outlast modern, resource-hungry solutions when true resilience is tested. The story of Ironwood and Auntie Corhonen goes beyond just stoves. It serves as a parable for our own time. We often prioritize speed and instant results. New technology gets chosen over methods that are proven, patient, and sustainable. We still build cast iron solutions today. They are quick fixes that consume resources rapidly. They offer immediate but fleeting results, and they often fail when things get hard. Think about our energy use, unsustainable farming, or supply chains that break down easily. The stone stove represents something different. It stands for resilience, sustainability, and a deep understanding of natural principles. It is about long-term thinking. It shows that thermal mass applies not just to heat, but to knowledge and culture too. The mockery of the cold stove shows how easily we dismiss wisdom, especially wisdom that does not fit our current ways of thinking. The challenge today is to recognize and value slow solutions. These solutions build real resilience. They might not offer instant returns. They might not fit modern expectations, but they work. Auntie's message was simple. Stone is patient. Stone works while you sleep, while you read, while you do other things. Stone does not demand all your attention every hour of every day. This applies to many areas. It works for building communities, caring for the environment, education, and even our personal well-being. It means investing in foundations that provide steady, lasting benefits. The lesson from Ironwood is clear. Sometimes the most advanced solutions are the ones that have stood the test of time. They do their work quietly, waiting for us to listen and learn. True building finish is not just about construction. It is about cultivating a mindset that values enduring wisdom over fleeting trends. Auntie Corhonen's journey represents a silent revolution. It transferred knowledge, not just technique. He brought a philosophy honed over centuries in Finland's boreal forests. This was about more than a better stove. It was a different way to live with the environment, with resources. The Finnish Peruni embodied this thinking. Survival through efficiency, patience as a virtue, wisdom passed down through generations. The American prairie had its own harsh winters. It became a crucible for this ancient technology, even though it resisted at first. The initial rejection showed the clash between local ways and imported wisdom. This happened even when that wisdom was crucial for survival. But the stone stove's success in ironwood proved sound principles work anywhere, no matter where they came from. It shows the power of careful observation and smart adaptation. It proves utility always wins over prejudice. This quiet revolution, started by one man and his patient stone, changed how a community lived. It embedded a piece of Finnish foresight into the American landscape. Antti Korhonen's arrival in America was more than just immigration. He brought a quiet revolution of knowledge. He carried a philosophy of living with extreme cold, forged over centuries in Finland's boreal forests. This was not just about building a better stove. It was about a different way to live with the land and its resources. The Finnish peruni, or stove, was the heart of this philosophy. It represented efficiency for survival, patience as a core virtue, and material knowledge passed down through generations. The American prairie, with its own brutal winters, became the perfect test for this ancient technology. The community's initial rejection showed the friction between established cultural norms and imported wisdom. This friction existed even when that wisdom was vital for survival. Yet the stone stove's success in ironwood proved the universal power of sound principles. It did not matter where they came from. It was a testament to careful observation, smart adaptation, and the eventual triumph of real usefulness over stubborn pride. This silent revolution, sparked by one man and his patient stone, changed how a community survived. It embedded a piece of Finnish foresight deep into the American landscape. Subscribe if this kind of overlooked wisdom fascinates you. There is more history hidden in plain sight. And, drop a comment. What ancient knowledge do you think we have forgotten that still holds powerful lessons for today? It was 43 degrees below zero. The wind howled down from the peaks at 95 kilometers an hour. Snow fell so thick that men froze to death within sight of their own front doors. This was February 1885 in the Colorado mining towns. 31 people died in that blizzard. Mine shafts disappeared under drifts. Cabins collapsed from the weight of the ice. The cold found every crack in every wall. It stole warmth from anyone who couldn't keep it out. In the town of Copperfield, the few who survived gathered in the only place the cold couldn't reach. They went deep inside the Gallagher mine. Everyone had called it a worthless, flooded wreck. But 43 souls huddled in chambers carved from solid rock. The earth itself kept them warm. It stayed at 13 degrees Celsius, no matter what the sky did above. This mine had been drained by a 17-year-old girl. Nora Gallagher had been right about everything they said was wrong. How did she do it? And how could a worthless, flooded mine save so many lives? Nora Gallagher had lost everything 6 months before the blizzard. A cave-in had taken both her parents. Her father, Patrick Gallagher, was working the lower tunnel when the supports gave way. Her mother, Mary Gallagher, was bringing him lunch. They found them together, still holding hands, buried under 1,000 tons of rock that no one would ever move. The mining company abandoned that claim the same week. The accident had ripped open an underground aquifer, and water poured into the tunnels faster than any pump could handle. Within a month, the Gallagher mine was completely flooded. 60 meters of water filled shafts that had taken 10 years to dig. "The claim is yours," the company lawyer told Nora. He handed her papers that felt like a cruel joke. "For whatever that's worth, which is nothing, less than nothing. You'll still owe taxes on worthless land." Foreman Silas Crenshaw was there when she signed those papers. He had worked with Nora's father for years. He had been the one to tell her that her parents were dead. Crenshaw had even been the one to suggest the company abandon the flooded claim instead of trying to save it. "Sell it to the company for salvage," he told her. "We'll give you $50 for the equipment we can recover. That's more than anyone else will pay for a hole full of water." He paused, looking at her with an unsettling pity. "Your father spent 10 years digging that mine. Now it's a grave. His grave and your mother's grave. A grave for anyone foolish enough to go near it. Take the $50, girl. Go somewhere else. Start over." Nora looked at him. She saw his blackened hands. She saw his calculating eyes. She saw how he had already written off everything her father had built. She thought about her parents still holding hands deep beneath the earth. "No," she said. Nora moved into the cabin above the mine the day after her parents' burial. She had nowhere else to go, no family in America. No money for a boat ticket back to Ireland. No skills that anyone in Copperfield needed. The cabin was her last possession. The flooded mine beneath it was all her parents had left her. She spent the first week just staring at the water. It filled the main shaft, black and still and cold. It stopped about 3 meters from the surface. It hid everything her father had built. The tunnels were gone. The ore veins were out of reach. The future her parents worked for was drowned, but the water wasn't rising anymore. That was the first thing Nora noticed. The flood had stopped at a certain level. It stayed there, 3 meters below the surface. It was exactly where her father's drainage tunnel would have emerged, if he had finished it. That's when old Tomasz found her. He was 83 years old, a Polish mining engineer. He came to Colorado 30 years ago and never left. He had worked every major mine in the territory. He designed drainage systems for claims everyone called hopeless. He forgot more about moving water through rock than most engineers ever learned. "You're the Gallagher girl," he said one morning. Nora was studying the water level, the one with the flooded claim. "I'm the Gallagher girl," she answered. "I don't know what I have." Tomasz looked at her. "You have a mine that's waiting to be drained." He walked to the edge of the shaft. He looked down at the black water. "Your father was smart. He started a drainage tunnel before the flood. Did you know that?" "He never finished it," Nora said. "No, but he got most of the way," Tomasz replied. "Another 15 or 20 meters. The water would drain out on its own. Gravity would do the work. The mine would empty itself." Nora stared at him. "You're saying I could drain this?" "I'm saying your father already did most of the work," Tomasz said. "Someone just needs to finish it." He smiled. His face creased into 1,000 lines. "The question is whether you're willing to dig 15 meters of tunnel through solid rock." She was willing. She had nothing else. Old Tomasz came every day that first autumn. He taught Nora how to read the mountain itself. He pointed to where her father's drainage tunnel met the hillside below the mine. It was just a narrow opening, barely visible, choked with years of debris. Tomasz showed her how to figure out the exact angle she needed to dig to reach the flooded shaft. He taught her how to build supports to keep the walls from caving in. He even showed her how to work alone in a tunnel without dying. "Mining is patience," he told her. "The mountain doesn't hurry. The water doesn't hurry. Only fools hurry underground. Your father knew that. That's why his tunnels were the safest in the valley until the day they weren't. He taught her things no engineering school could ever teach. The faint feel of rock about to give way. The subtle sound of water moving through stone deep underground. The way the air changed when she was close to an open space. He told her to trust her hands, her ears, her instincts. This was wisdom from 50 years spent underground. One afternoon they sat at the tunnel entrance, eating bread and cheese. Tomasz told Nora about his home. "In Silesia, where I came from, we had mines that had been flooded for generations," he said. "Everyone said they were lost forever, but water always follows gravity. Find the right path, dig the right tunnel, and the water will leave on its own. It doesn't want to stay trapped any more than we do." Nora learned patience. She dug through the autumn, working by lantern light, carving through the same rock her father had planned to carve. She hauled the broken rock out by hand, bucket by bucket. A pile of stone grew larger outside the tunnel every day. Her hands blistered, then turned to tough calluses. Her shoulders ached, then grew strong. Her back learned to bend in ways it never had before. She worked 10 hours a day, sometimes 12, sometimes more. She worked until her arms couldn't lift a pickaxe anymore. Then she slept. Then she woke and worked again. She measured her progress in centimeters. 7 centimeters today, 10 centimeters tomorrow. Sometimes only 5 on the days when the rock was hardest. The people of Copperfield thought she was mad. They saw her disappear into the hillside every morning. They saw her emerge every evening, covered in rock dust and exhaustion. They heard about her plan to drain the flooded mine, and they laughed. Foreman Crenshaw came to see her work in November. He brought a group of miners who wanted to see the crazy orphan. "Look at this foolishness," he said, gesturing at the narrow tunnel she had carved. "She's digging toward water that will drown her. She's going to break through into that flooded shaft and die the same way her parents died." The miners laughed. Nora kept digging. "The Gallagher claim is cursed," Crenshaw continued. "It killed her father. It killed her mother, and it'll kill her too if she keeps this up. Mark my words. That mine will never be worked again. It's nothing but a grave now, and she's digging her way into it." Nora set down her pickaxe. She turned to face him. Her hands were calloused, her shoulders were strong, her eyes held something that made Crenshaw take a step backward. "My father believed in this mine," she said. "He spent 10 years building it. He died trying to make it work. You think I'm going to walk away because you say it's cursed? The mine is flooded," Crenshaw said. "The mine is waiting," Nora answered. "There's a difference." She picked up her pickaxe and went back to work. The men eventually left. Their laughter echoed off the tunnel walls as they walked away. But some of them weren't laughing anymore. Some of them were looking at the work she had done, at the progress she had made, at the determination that wouldn't quit. Some of them were starting to wonder if maybe the orphan knew something they didn't. On December 3rd, 1884, Nora was alone in the tunnel. She had dug 16 meters from where she started. Then, the rock changed under her pickaxe. It felt softer, wetter. She heard a hollow sound from the other side, like an echo in a vast, empty space. She had reached the flooded shaft. She didn't break through right away. That would have killed her. 60 meters of water would rush through a hole barely big enough to crawl through. Instead, she did what Tomasz taught her. She drilled a small hole, just wide enough for a finger. Then, she waited. Water began to trickle out, slowly at first, then faster. Soon a steady stream flowed down the drainage tunnel. It followed the slope she had created, pouring out of the hillside below the mine. The mine was draining itself, just as Tomasz had said it would. It took 3 weeks for the water to empty completely. 3 weeks of watching the level drop foot by foot. It revealed tunnels that had been underwater for 6 months. It showed veins that still held silver. It uncovered chambers carved from solid rock that had never seen daylight since the flood. Nora explored the drained mine carefully. She carried lanterns into spaces her father had carved, places her mother had never seen. She found her father's tools, pickaxes, shovels, drill bits. They were still sharp, even after months underwater. She found the ore cart he had been loading when the flood came, still half full of silver-bearing rock. She even found her mother's lunch pail. It sat on a ledge where the water had left it, still holding the bread and cheese meant for a meal that never happened. Deep in those chambers, where her father had carved deepest into the mountain, Nora found something she hadn't expected. The earth was warm, not just cool like a cellar, but a steady, constant 13 degrees Celsius. It stayed that way, no matter how cold the air grew above ground. The rock itself held heat, stored from past summers. It was like memory held in the mind. The deeper chambers were warmer still, heated by the Earth's own fire. Forces had been working there since before humans walked these mountains. Tomasz came to see what she had found. He made his way down the drained shaft on ladders Nora had built from salvaged timber. He pressed his palm against the warm rock and closed his eyes. He felt the heat that flowed from the earth itself. "This is what the old miners called the living stone," he said. "The earth that remembers summer no matter what winter does above. In Silesia, we had mines like this, deep enough that the cold could never reach. People would shelter in them when the worst winters came. The stone held them safe." Nora looked at him. "My father never told me about this." Tomasz shook his head. He might not have known. The flood came before he dug this deep. But he was getting close. Another few months, and he would have found what you found. Tomasz smiled, his old face creasing into 1,000 lines of satisfaction. "You finished what he started, and you found what he was looking for, even if he didn't know he was looking for it. The mine was drained, and an unexpected warmth had been found. Nora had drained the flooded mine. She had found a shelter that would never freeze. She had found the warmth her father had been digging toward all along. That year, winter came on hard. The first snow fell in late December. It kept falling through January. Drifts piled higher and higher. They reached the roof lines of the mining cabins. The temperature dropped steadily, minus 29 degrees, minus 34 degrees, minus 40 degrees. The world above turned white and deadly. Nora stayed inside her mountain. She was warm and safe. She started getting ready for what she knew was coming. She stockpiled food in the chambers. The temperature there never changed. She brought in firewood for cooking. The stone itself gave enough warmth to survive. She built sleeping platforms along the warmest walls. There was enough room for dozens of people if they ever needed it. Some of the townspeople saw her getting ready. They asked what she was doing. Nora told them the truth. She was making the mine ready to shelter anyone who needed it. They laughed. They always laughed at everything she did, but Nora kept preparing anyway. The working mine started failing in early February, shafts filled with ice, equipment froze solid. Men who had worked underground their whole lives found themselves trapped. The cold was a force no fire could fight. Foreman Crenshaw's mines were too shallow to escape it. Their tunnels were for moving ore, not for keeping people alive. When the temperature dropped low enough, even the earth around them froze. Then the blizzard came. It hit on February 8th, 1885. There was no warning. A wall of white appeared on the western horizon. The wind went from a whisper to a scream in less than an hour. By nightfall, people were dying. The cold was a living thing. It hunted through every crack, every gap, every weakness in walls that had seemed solid. Cabins that had been warm became iceboxes. Stoves that had always been enough couldn't keep up. People huddled together under every blanket they owned. They still felt the cold stealing their lives. Foreman Crenshaw's house failed first. The wind ripped off his roof in the middle of the night. He barely got out alive. He struggled through the snow toward the company bunkhouse. But that was failing too. Windows shattered, walls buckled, heat bled away faster than the stoves could make it. By dawn of the second day, there was no place left to go. No place except the mine, everyone called cursed. The survivors came in ones and twos at first. Then, in groups, they struggled up the hill toward the Gallagher claim. Someone remembered the orphan girl and her drained mine. They came because they had no other choice. Nora met them at the mine entrance. Her face glowed in the light of lanterns that burned steady in the still tunnel air. "Come in," she said. "There's room." They stepped inside. A warmth radiated from the walls, a steady, constant 13 degrees Celsius. The world outside froze solid. They walked deeper into the mountain, following tunnels Nora's father had carved. They passed through chambers that had been underwater just 6 months before, and they wept. Not from the cold, but from relief. From the simple miracle of being warm when warmth seemed impossible. 43 people crowded into the Gallagher mine that night, men who had laughed at Nora's work, women who had whispered she was mad. Children who had been told the mine was haunted by the ghosts of her dead parents. They all came. Nora took them all in. Foreman Silas Crenshaw arrived on the third day. His face was gray with frostbite, his hands too frozen to close. He stood at the entrance to the mine, the claim he had called worthless. The tunnels, he said, would kill her. He couldn't meet her eyes. "Please," was all he said. Nora looked at him for a long moment. She remembered the laughter. She remembered the $50 offer. She remembered being told her parents' mine was nothing but a grave. "Come in," she said. "There's room." They stayed for 9 days. The blizzard howled and died, leaving snow piled in drifts that would take months to melt away. Inside the mountain, they shared Nora's food, her water, and her warmth. They slept in tunnels her father had carved, on floors her mother had walked. The mine everyone once called cursed now held them safe. The children were the first to let go of their fear. They ran through the dark tunnels as if playing in a grand castle. Their laughter echoed off walls that had known only the ring of pickaxes and the boom of dynamite. Slowly, the adults followed. They began to see the mine as Nora saw it, not as a grave, but as a shelter. Old Tomash arrived on the 4th day. He had survived the storm, buried in his own cabin, wrapped in blankets and prayers. But he wanted to see what Nora had built. He looked at the chambers, now full of people, the tunnels warm with life. "Your father would be proud," he told Nora. This is what he was working toward, even if he didn't know it. A mine that could shelter a community, a place where the mountain itself keeps you warm. Nora simply said he never got to see it. Tomash nodded. "No, but you finished what he started." That's what children do. They finish what their parents begin. When the storm finally broke, the survivors climbed out to a changed world. 31 people had died in the valley's mining towns. Cabins were destroyed. Equipment lay ruined. The cold had crippled the entire mining industry. But everyone who made it to the Gallagher mine survived. 43 souls who should have frozen were alive. An orphan girl had drained a flooded shaft. She had found a warmth no one knew existed. That spring, Foreman Crenshaw stood before the survivors. His voice was rough with shame. He made a public confession. "I called this mine worthless," he said. "I offered $50 for a claim that's worth more than anything I've ever owned. I told everyone the Gallagher girl was digging her own grave. He paused, looking at the faces of the people he had almost left to die. I was wrong about the mine, about the girl, about everything. She saved my life with the claim I said was cursed. He turned to Nora, who stood at the edge of the crowd with Tomash beside her. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I understand now. Your father built something that will outlast all of us, and you finished what he started. Nora looked back at him. This was the man who had mocked her, who tried to buy her inheritance for nothing, who had been so sure she would die. My father believed in this, mine, she said. My mother believed in him. They died trying to build something that would last. I drained that water because I had nowhere else to go and nothing else to lose. But I'm keeping it. I'm making it a shelter for anyone who needs it, because that's what my parents would have wanted. She looked at the survivors, at the faces that had once laughed at her. Anyone who wants to learn, I'll teach. The mountain is patient. It will keep whoever knows how to ask. Nora Gallagher never left Copperfield. She worked the mine for another 40 years. She pulled silver from veins the flood had revealed. She carved out chambers big enough for more than 100 people. She married Thomas Brennan, a young miner. He was one of the survivors, and he understood what it meant to be saved by someone's sheer stubbornness. They raised 5 children in the cabin above the mine. All of them learned the skills their mother had picked up from old Tomash. The mine kept its temperature, 13 degrees Celsius, summer and winter. Decade after decade, it stayed warm, a constant heat held deep in the mountain's heart. Old Tomash died the spring after the blizzard, peacefully in his cabin. They buried him on the hillside right above the mine. His headstone read simply, "He taught her to read the mountain." Foreman Crenshaw left his job that winter. He spent the rest of his life helping to turn other mines into emergency shelters. He tried to fix the damage his own dismissal had almost caused. He died in 1892. His gravestone, by his own request, said only, "She was right. I was wrong." The phrase Gallagher's mine became part of Colorado's language. It meant any inheritance that seemed worthless until it saved your life. When someone was laughed at for seeing value where others saw nothing, the old-timers would shake their heads. They'd say, "Remember Gallagher's mine. Remember the girl who drained a flood. That mine is still there." 140 years later, it still holds its 13 degrees Celsius. The tunnels Nora's father carved still stand. The drainage tunnel she finished still works. The chambers that saved 43 people still wait, ready for anyone who needs them. The blizzard of February 1885 killed 31 people in the mining towns of Colorado Territory. But 43 souls survived because of Gallagher's mine, a shelter built on warmth and human persistence. True value is often hidden in what others dismiss as worthless. Persistence can turn a grave into a refuge. Subscribe if this kind of story is your thing. There are more where this came from. And drop a comment. What old technique do you think we've forgotten that still has a use nobody's seen yet? January of 1887. They would later call it the Great Die-Up after the bodies were counted. But right then, in the furious Montana blizzard, the people of Clearwater had no name for what was killing them. The temperature had fallen to negative 40 degrees Celsius. Snow drifted higher than their rooftops, and the firewood was gone. 3 miles north of town, a small cabin sat in a shallow valley. Steam rose from the frozen earth around it. Inside, Ezra Whitmore added no wood to any fire. He didn't need one. His walls were warm to the touch, heated by ancient forces bubbling up from deep below. His buckskin gelding, Flint, stood content in a stable that had never known frost. Pipes under the floor carried water heated by the earth itself. They radiated warmth into every corner of the home, a place the people of Clearwater called the Devil's Bathhouse. Ezra poured himself a cup of coffee. He settled into his chair. He listened to the blizzard rage against his walls, impotent and useless. He wondered how long it would take before they came. Meanwhile, Thaddeus Crane, a man who had built his fortune selling timber, stood in the ruins of his own business. His lumberyard lay buried. His delivery wagons were frozen solid. His warehouse, stacked high with seasoned pine and oak, might as well have been on the moon. He had charged $3 a cord in autumn, then $5, then $10 as winter deepened. Now he had nothing left to sell at any price, and the cold was creeping into his own bones. How had Ezra Whitmore achieved this impossible comfort? And what would happen when the town discovered his secret? Ezra Whitmore arrived in Clearwater, Montana during the spring of 1884. He was 45 years old. For 20 years, Ezra had been a mining engineer, spending his days deep underground in Nevada and California. He crawled through the hot, unstable earth, seeing things most men only dreamed of. Rivers of molten rock, chambers of scalding steam, waters that could strip flesh from bone in seconds. But Ezra also saw something else. He saw how that terrible raw heat could be tamed, how it could be put to work, channeled, made to serve instead of destroy. Then, a cave-in ended his mining career. His left leg was crushed under a fallen beam. He learned to walk again, but he would never again climb down a shaft. The mining company gave him a small pension and a letter of thanks for his 18 years of service. He used that money to buy a wagon, a horse, and supplies. Then, he headed north. He wasn't looking for gold or silver. He didn't want farmland. Ezra Whitmore was looking for heat. The hot springs of the Yellowstone region were legendary. Ezra had read every report. He studied every survey. He knew that beneath the mountains and valleys of Montana and Wyoming lay a vast reservoir of geothermal energy places where the Earth's inner fire reached close to the surface. Most people saw these hot springs as just curiosities, places to soak tired muscles or to gawk at steaming pools. Ezra saw something else entirely. He saw a source of heat that would never run out, a heat that needed no chopping, no hauling, no buying. He saw independence. He found his paradise in a shallow valley. It sat 3 miles north of Clearwater. There, a cluster of hot springs pushed up through the rocky ground. Their water held a steady temperature of 60 degrees Celsius all year long. The biggest pool stretched about 6 meters across. Steam constantly rose from its surface. Mineral deposits ringed the edges, painted white, yellow, and rust. A faint but clear smell of sulfur hung in the air. Most settlers would have turned away. The smell alone would be enough. The strange, almost alien look of those mineral shapes would have sent them running. But Ezra Whitmore saw something else. He saw paradise. He filed a claim for 32 hectares. Those acres included the entire spring cluster. The land office clerk in Clearwater, a young man named Patterson, looked at the survey map. He couldn't hide his confusion. "This is the Sulphur Flats, Mr. Whitmore," he said. "Nothing grows there. The water's not fit to drink. The whole place smells like rotten eggs." "I am aware," Ezra answered. Patterson tried again. "You could have farmland, river bottom. There are good parcels available south of town." "I want this land," Ezra said. "This exact land." Patterson just shrugged and stamped the papers. The claim cost Ezra $12. It would be the best investment he ever made. News of the stranger's unusual land purchase spread quickly through Clearwater. It was a small town. Cattle ranching and the timber trade kept it alive. Any novelty was welcome entertainment. Then word got out that the newcomer planned to build a house right next to the hot springs. Not just next to them, but somehow incorporating them into his home. The entertainment became a sensation. Thaddeus Crane held court at his lumber yard. Ranchers and townsmen gathered there to buy cordwood and trade gossip. Crane was a big man. He had a red face and an easy laugh. His business was built on a simple truth. Montana winters were brutal. Men would pay a lot to survive them. He sold more firewood than anyone in the territory. He liked it that way. "The engineer means to heat his house with brimstone," Crane announced to the general, murmuring. "He'll build his cabin on the devil's doorstep and warm himself with hellfire." Crane snorted. "I expect Old Scratch will be charging him rent by Christmas." The nickname stuck. From that day forward, Ezra's claim became known as the Devil's Bathhouse. Mayor Rutledge was a cautious man. He owed his position mostly to Crane's money. He shook his head with practiced concern. "It's unwholesome," he declared. "A man living in sulfur fumes. It cannot be healthy. I would not be surprised if he takes ill before the first snow." The women of Clearwater were less reserved. Dorotha, Crane's wife, led them. They spoke of witchcraft and ungodliness. They talked about a man who consorted with the forces of the underworld. Mrs. Crane even organized a prayer meeting. It was specifically to address the spiritual danger the newcomer represented. Ezra worked through all of it. The way he built his house was unlike anything Clearwater had ever seen. He started not with walls or a roof. He started with pipes. Hundreds of feet of copper and lead piping arrived from Helena, a huge expense. He dug trenches from the biggest hot spring. He laid the pipes in careful lines beneath where his floor would be. The hot water from the spring, he explained to anyone who asked, would flow through these pipes all the time. It would move heat through the whole house. Then it would go back into the earth. The Romans did this, he told Flint one evening. He tamped earth around a section of new pipe. 2,000 years ago. Hypocaust, they called it. Heat from below. Ezra paused. We think we're so clever. But the ancients knew. Flint, being a horse, offered no opinion. The cabin itself was small, but its design was special. The walls were double thick. He packed them with sawdust for insulation. The windows were small. Each one had 2 layers of glass with an air gap in between. The floor was thick stone. Ezra chose it because it could soak up heat from the pipes below and then send it out into the room. A stable next to the cabin, connected by a short passage, would keep Flint warm with the same system. The total cost, including the land, all the materials, and that precious piping, came to $287. By October of 1884, the Devil's Bathhouse was finished. The first real test came with the autumn frosts. As temperatures fell, the people of Clearwater started lighting their stoves and fireplaces. Ezra Whitmore did nothing. His cabin stayed warm. The stone floor put out a gentle, steady heat. The walls felt no cold. Every other house in the valley grew chilly. Curious visitors came to see it. Most left shaking their heads. They just could not understand what they saw. It's unnatural, said Samuel Briggs, the blacksmith. Heat without fire. It goes against the Lord's design. Mrs. Patterson, the clerk's wife, wrinkled her nose. The smell alone would drive me mad, she said. Sulfur in your nose day and night. How does he even sleep? The truth was, the sulfur smell inside the cabin was faint. Ezra had made sure the system kept it to a minimum, but the truth mattered less than what people believed. The Devil's Bathhouse stayed a place of suspicion and ridicule. Thaddeus Crane watched Ezra with particular attention. A man who needed no firewood would never be his customer. Worse, if others followed Ezra's example, Crane's entire business could collapse. He doubled down on his mockery. The engineer sits in his sulfur pit like a lizard on a rock, Crane told the men at the saloon. Cold-blooded, I reckon. Not quite human. He said a man should earn his warmth with honest labor, chopping wood, hauling timber. Not squatting over the devil's chimney like some kind of heathen. The mockery continued through the mild winter of 1884 to 1885. It went on through the moderate winter that followed. Ezra sold no firewood to Crane's customers. He rarely came to town at all. He tended a small garden in the warmth near the springs. A few chickens thrived in his heated stable. He lived a quiet, self-sufficient life. But Ezra watched the sky. He worried. An old Crow woman lived in the hills. She spoke broken English, shared with few white men. She told him a great cold was coming. 3 winters, she had said, holding up 3 gnarled fingers. 3rd winter, the death winter. Many die. She pointed at Ezra, then at the steam rising from his springs. You live. Ezra took her words seriously. The Crow people had survived in this land for generations before the white man came. They knew things no survey or scientific journal could teach. The summer of 1886 was hot and dry. The autumn was warm, almost pleasant. But Ezra noticed the signs others missed. The elk moved to lower ground earlier than usual. The beaver built their lodges thicker. The caterpillars he found were banded solid black. In November, the first blizzard struck. It was not a normal storm. It was a white apocalypse. The temperature, which had been mild the day before, plunged 33 degrees Celsius in a matter of hours. The wind rose to a shriek. Snow fell so thick and fast that a man could lose his way between his house and his barn. Cattle caught in the open froze where they stood. The people of Clearwater huddled around their stoves. They fed them everything they had. The storm lasted 4 days. When it finally broke, the town emerged to a world transformed. Snow lay in drifts 6 meters high. The roads were impassable. The cattle, the foundation of Clearwater's economy, were dying by the thousands across the open range. And it was only November. The winter of 1886 to 87 earned its place in history. It became known as the worst the northern plains had ever seen. Storm after storm hammered the territory. The cold was brutal. Temperatures rarely rose above zero, often plunging to 30, 40, even 50 degrees below. The snow never melted. It just piled higher, burying fences, then buildings, then hope itself. Firewood became more precious than gold. Thaddeus Crane had started the winter with his warehouses full, but his stock vanished with terrifying speed. Every family in Clearwater burned 2 or 3 times their normal amount, just to stay alive. The demand was endless. The price of a cord of wood shot up to $5, then $10, then $20. Desperate men who had never stolen in their lives started eyeing their neighbors' wood piles. By January, Crane had nothing left. His delivery wagons sat frozen, buried in drifts. His logging crews couldn't reach the forests. For the first time, Thaddeus Crane had nothing to sell. Even his own family began to shiver. The death started quietly. Old Mrs. Hernandez lived alone at the edge of town. They found her frozen in her bed. She had burned her furniture, then her books, then everything else that would catch fire. The cold took her anyway. A week later, the younger family, a mother, father, and 3 children, died when their cabin collapsed under the weight of the snow. They couldn't dig themselves out in time. Clearwater was dying. 3 miles north, Ezra Whitmore lived in impossible comfort. His geothermal system worked perfectly. Hot water from the springs flowed constantly through his pipes. The floor stayed a steady 21 degrees Celsius, no matter the chaos outside. His well-insulated walls held the warmth inside. His stable was so warm he could groom his buckskin gelding, Flint, without gloves. Ezra had months of food, dried meat, preserved vegetables from his thermal garden, and eggs from chickens that never knew a cold day. His water came from a small spring that emerged warm from the earth, never freezing. Ezra was immune to the disaster destroying his neighbors, but he was not without conscience. This catastrophe was only just beginning. Ezra Whitmore made his first delivery on a January morning. The temperature stood at minus 38 degrees Celsius. He loaded his small sledge with blankets, dried food, and jugs of warm water. Then he drove Flint through the frozen wasteland toward town. The journey took 4 hours. They pushed through drifts that would have stopped any horse less hardy than Flint. He stopped first at the Hernandez place, but he was too late. He then went to the homes of those he knew were most vulnerable, the elderly, the sick, the families with young children. He left supplies at their doors, never waiting for thanks. Ezra was not seeking gratitude, he was simply seeking to help. Word of his actions spread quickly. The man from the Devil's Bathhouse was delivering aid. The man they had mocked was offering salvation. By the end of January, a steady stream of refugees began making the treacherous journey to Ezra's Valley. They came on foot, on horseback, and in wagons pulled by starving mules. They came because they had heard a rumor a place existed where warmth was real, a place where the earth itself provided heat, a place where a man could survive without firewood. Ezra welcomed them all. His cabin could not hold everyone, so he helped them build shelters near the springs themselves. These were simple structures of canvas and timber. He positioned them to catch the warmth that rose from the steaming pools. It was not comfortable, but it was survivable. The springs that had once seemed so strange and unwholesome now felt like a miracle. Thaddeus Crane was among the last to arrive. He came on a February afternoon. His fine coat hung in tatters. His proud bearing was broken. His wife and children walked beside him. They were too exhausted to ride the horse that could barely walk itself. Crane stopped at the edge of Ezra's property. He could go no farther. Ezra met him there. For a long moment, the 2 men simply looked at each other. The lumber baron who had called Ezra cold-blooded, the man who had laughed at his methods, the man who had profited from the very dependency Ezra had sought to escape, and the engineer who had been proven right in the most terrible way imaginable. "Mr. Whitmore," Crane said, his voice barely a whisper, "I have come to beg." Ezra looked at the man's family. His wife shivered uncontrollably. His children had the hollow eyes of those who had known true cold. He looked at Crane himself, broken and desperate. "You are welcome here," Ezra said simply. "All of you. Come inside and warm yourselves." Crane's eyes filled with tears. "After everything I said." "Words spoken in ignorance are easily forgiven," Ezra replied. "Come. The springs do not care who mock them. They offer their warmth to all." The Crane family was given a place near the largest pool. The heat there was strongest. Thaddeus Crane, who had built his fortune selling warmth to others, sat in silence. He let the earth's fire thaw his frozen bones. 53 people found shelter at the Devil's Bathhouse that winter. Not one of them died. When the spring thaw finally came in late March, the true scale of the disaster became clear. An estimated 60% of the cattle in Montana Territory lay dead. Dozens of settlers froze in their homes. The people of Clearwater finally understood what they owed to the man they had ridiculed. A town meeting was called in April. The church was too damaged to use, so they gathered in Crane's empty lumber warehouse. It was a bitter irony, lost on no one. Thaddeus Crane stood to speak first. He was a changed man, humbled in ways that went deeper than words. 2 years ago, he began, I stood in this very building and called Ezra Whitmore cold-blooded. I said he was not quite human. I mocked his methods and questioned his character. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. I was a fool. A prideful, ignorant fool, he continued, drawing a sharp contrast. While I was selling firewood at $10 a cord, he was giving warmth away for free. While I was getting rich on other men's desperation, he was planning for a future I refused to see. He turned to face Ezra, who sat quietly in the back of the gathering. Mr. Whitmore, you saved my family. You saved this town. I do not ask for your forgiveness. I have not earned it. Crane's voice dropped to a plea. I only ask that you teach us, show us how to live as you live. Help us build a community that will never freeze again. The warehouse fell silent. Every face in the room turned toward the engineer from Nevada. Ezra rose slowly, his bad legs stiff from sitting. I came to Montana seeking independence, he said. I wanted to need no man for warmth, to answer to no one for my survival. What I found was something different. He looked around the room, at the faces of those who had mocked him, avoided him, called him names. I found that independence means nothing if your neighbors are dying. I found that the warmth of the earth is meant to be shared. He paused again. I will teach anyone who wishes to learn. Not because you have earned it, but because knowledge, like heat, does no good when it is hoarded. He looked at them, a quiet strength in his gaze. The springs are there for all of us. Let us use them together. When summer returned to Clearwater, the town began to rebuild, not the same way as before. This time, Ezra Whitmore led the way. They mapped out all the hot spots, the springs and seeps bubbling up from the ground. Then they put down pipes. They built structures to catch the earth's heat. The community would never again depend on a lumber merchant or a woodpile. Thaddeus Crane completely gave up the timber business. He put all the money he had left into this new heating system. He worked beside the very men he used to take advantage of. It was, he said, the first honest work of his life. Soon, a phrase became common in town, building on the springs. It meant looking past the obvious. It meant finding value where others saw only trouble. People spoke it with respect, almost reverence. Ezra Whitmore lived to be 79. He never married, but he became like a father to the whole community. He taught generations of settlers how to use the earth's warmth. His first cabin still stands today. It's a historical site. The pipes under its floor still carry hot water. The springs still bubble up, unchanged after all these years. On the wall of that cabin, someone carved a simple message long after Ezra was gone. It reads, "The earth remembers heat." The old crow woman, if she ever knew how her prophecy came true, would have understood perfectly. That winter of January 1887, the Great Die-Up, ended with Clearwater transformed. It became a resilient community, self-sufficient, built on shared warmth from the earth. That change shows us something important. When times are good, a truly new idea often looks foolish. People laugh at it, but when things get hard, when crisis hits, those same unconventional ideas can become salvation. This happens when they come from a deeper understanding of how the natural world works. The earth offers gifts. We just need to be wise enough to see them. If Ezra Whitmore's story sparked something in you, subscribe. And tell me, what foolish idea today do you think might be tomorrow's salvation?